in a monastery nestled among rolling green hills, where the year is 1232. Brother Edmund tends the chandlery with hands that know their work by heart. The scent of beeswax and honey fills the quiet workshop, and the gentle warmth of the melting vats creates a sanctuary of peace within stone walls. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will take us to a Benedictine monastery in the year 1232, where we will follow Brother Edmund, the master chandler, through a day of quiet craftsmanship and ancient rhythms. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. The winter dawn came late to the chandlery, and Brother Edmund welcomed the delay. The cold night air had crystallized the beeswax in the storage room, making it easier to weigh and measure. He moved through the workshop with the ease of a man who had spent 30 years in this same room, his movements as familiar to his body as breathing. The beeswax had arrived 3 days prior from the outlying apiaries where the monastery kept its hives. Brother Edmund had watched the beekeepers bring the golden blocks carefully packed in linen, each one carrying the essence of summer flowers and patient labor. Now, in the depths of winter, this captured warmth would be transformed into light. He began with the measuring, a task that required neither haste nor worry. Each candle in the monastery required a precise amount of wax, and Brother Edmund had long ago stopped counting. His hands simply knew. The balance scale sat before him, brass and steady, a tool his predecessor had taught him to read as naturally as reading scripture. The morning bell had rung for prime, but Brother Edmund remained in the chandlery. This was his permitted work, his craft, his small corner of the monastery where his presence was expected and needed. The abbot had assigned him here 20 years ago, when his knees had begun to ache from kneeling in the fields, and Edmund had discovered a profound contentment he had not anticipated. He set the first batch into the melting vessel, watching as the pale golden blocks softened beneath the gentle heat. The fire burned steadily in the small hearth, carefully tended to maintain the precise warmth that beeswax required. Too hot and the wax would scorch, turning brittle and dark. Too cool and it would refuse to transform. Brother Edmund knew this balance the way a mother knows her infant's breathing. As the wax began to flow like liquid gold, he prepared the molds. These were his own creation, developed over decades of patient refinement. Each mold was carved from a wood so fine it had taken him 5 years to season it properly. The molds hung in a precise row, suspended from a frame of ash wood, waiting with the patience of objects that lived for one purpose only. The wax melted completely, becoming almost luminous in the morning light that filtered through the high, narrow windows of the chandelier. Brother Edmund had positioned these windows with deliberate care many years ago, allowing just enough light to see his work without permitting the sun's heat to interfere with his craft. He dipped the first wick carefully into the golden pool. The rush had been prepared days before by another brother, soaked in the rendered fat until it held its shape and fiber. Now, dipped in beeswax, it would transform into something far more precious. Each immersion would coat the wick with a thin layer of wax, and each layer would add to its substance, its brightness, its ability to burn with a steady, pure flame. Dip after dip, layer upon layer. The rhythm was meditative, almost liturgical in its repetition. Dip, wait for the coating to set, dip again. Dip, wait, dip. The movement became nearly unconscious, his hands performing an action they had performed thousands upon thousands of times. Brother Edmund's fingers bore the subtle marks of his work. The skin on his right hand was slightly thickened from decades of handling warm wax, but it was no longer sensitive to the temperature that would cause pain in others. His fingernails bore faint traces of wax that no amount of scrubbing would entirely remove. He did not mind. These marks were the visible testament of his faithfulness. By the time the bell for sext rang at midday, the first batch of candles had begun to take their final form. Brother Edmund set them aside to cool fully, their pale golden surfaces already beginning to solidify into the glossy finish that would make them precious to every corner of the monastery. These candles would burn in the great church during services. These would light the abbot's study where monastery business was conducted. These would illuminate the infirmary where monks lay ill, their steady flames a comfort and a constant. He stepped outside for a moment, as he did each day at midday, to let the winter air clear the accumulated warmth from the candlery. The snow lay thick on the monastery grounds, pristine and quiet. The kitchen building exhaled smoke gently into the pale gray sky. From somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint sound of monks chanting, their voices carrying the office of sext across the cold stone walls. Edmund stood for a moment, his hands resting on the wooden railing, and felt the profound satisfaction of a man who had spent his life doing exactly what he was made to do. This work, this careful attention to light and transformation, connected him to something larger than himself. Every candle he made would burn in service to God. Every flame would illuminate prayers. Every moment of his labor was woven into the spiritual life of the community. He returned to the chandelier, and the familiar warmth welcomed him back like an old friend. The afternoon had settled into that particular quality of winter stillness, where time seemed to move differently. Brother Edmund returned to his work with the ease of a man, resuming a conversation he had paused only moments before, though the bell had already called the monastery to the refectory for the midday meal. He had taken only bread and thin broth, eaten standing in a corner of the refectory, his mind already returning to the chandelier. The abbot understood. Some brothers needed to be at prayer. Some needed to be in the fields or the scriptorum. Brother Edmund needed to be here, among the molds and the fire and the golden transformation of beeswax into light. The second batch was ready now. He had prepared it while the first candles cooled, measuring out the precise amount with the same unhurried attention he brought to every element of his craft. This batch would be for the smaller rooms, the dormitory passages, the places where monks needed gentle light for reading or prayer in the early morning hours before dawn. As he began the dipping process again, his mind settled into that particular state of peaceful focus that his work always brought. His hands knew exactly what to do. The rhythm was so deeply embedded in his body that he could allow his thoughts to wander while his fingers continued their practiced motion. He thought of Brother Cuthbert, who had trained him in this craft 3 decades ago. Cuthbert had been old even then, his hands gnarled but still capable of extraordinary precision. The old chandler had taught Edmund not through many words, but through patient demonstration and quiet correction. Once, when Edmund had rushed a dipping and created an uneven candle, Cuthbert had simply set it aside and said, "Haste is the enemy of light, young brother. The wax knows no urgency. Neither should we." Edmund had never forgotten. He had made that principle the foundation of everything he did. The candles were taking on their characteristic shape now, growing rounder and more substantial with each dipping. He could already envision how they would look when finished, their surfaces smooth and gleaming, their color the pale gold of late autumn honey. These candles burned differently than the tallow candles made in the kitchen. Beeswax burned cleaner, brighter, with a light that seemed almost alive compared to the smoking, guttering flames of rendered animal fat. The monastery had enough beeswax only for the most important candles. The great altar received beeswax candles for every service. The abbot's study burned them during the darkest months of winter. The infirmary used them when a brother lay gravely ill, the pure light somehow offering comfort beyond the merely practical. The rest of the monastery made do with tallow, and Edmund respected that economy. It made the beeswax candles more precious, more valued. But here in the chandlery, Edmund burned beeswax in his own small lamp. The abbot had granted him this small luxury years ago, recognizing that the master chandler needed to work by the light of what he created. Edmund's lamp hung above his work table, burning steadily, casting its warm glow across the molds and the melting vats and the slowly forming candles. It had become such a constant part of his world that he barely noticed it anymore. The way one stops noticing the presence of something beloved. A knock came at the door, soft and respectful. Brother Edmund called out permission to enter, and a young monk stepped into the warm chandlery, his eyes blinking against the sudden shift from the cold corridor to the heated workshop. "Brother Edmund," the young man said, his voice carrying the careful politeness of a novice speaking to a senior brother. "The abbot requests that you prepare 20 additional candles for the bishop's visit next month. He will be staying for the feast of Saint Bridget." Edmund nodded slowly, his hands never ceasing their rhythmic motion. 20 candles for the bishop. This was an honor and a responsibility. The bishop would expect candles of exceptional quality, candles that reflected the monastery's respect and its resources. "Tell the abbot that it will be done," Edmund said. "I will begin a special batch tomorrow after I have finished these." The young monk bowed slightly, uncertain whether to leave or say more. Edmund could see the question forming on the boy's face, the desire to stay in the warm room, to watch the transformation of wax into light. Edmund recognized the look. He had worn it himself once when he was new to this craft. "Come," Edmund said, gesturing with his chin. "Watch for a moment if you wish, but stand there by the wall where the heat does not disturb you." The young monk's face brightened with a tentative smile. He moved to the indicated spot and stood quietly, watching as Edmund continued his work. There was something in the boy's bearing that reminded Edmund of his younger self, that quality of seeking, of wondering whether there might be meaning in the small tasks of monastic life. "What is your name?" Edmund asked, not pausing in his work. "Brother Thomas, Brother Edmund." I arrived at the monastery only 6 months ago. And what is your assigned work, Brother Thomas? I am learning the bakery, brother. But I confess that I find the kitchen hot and the work of measuring flour and kneading dough somewhat tedious. Edmund smiled slightly. He understood. The bakery was essential work, and the abbot assigned brothers to it according to need and capability. But it was not work that spoke to every soul. Come back here on the evening of the feast of Saint Martin, Edmund said. I have candles that did not meet my standards, small imperfections that the abbot will not require. If you wish, you may take them to the dormitory. Perhaps the light of beeswax will be more pleasant to read by than tallow. Brother Thomas's eyes widened with an emotion Edmund recognized as gratitude mixed with something more profound. A sense of being seen, of having his inner dissatisfaction acknowledged and gently honored. Thank you, Brother Edmund, the young man said softly. I will return as you have suggested. After Thomas had left, Edmund found his hands moving even more slowly, his attention even more focused on the precision of each dipping. He thought about the young monk, about the choices that lay before him in his early years of monastic life. Some brothers would find their calling in prayer, some in manual labor, some in the teaching of younger monks. It took time to discover where one's gifts lay, where one's hands and heart aligned with purpose. Perhaps Brother Thomas would become a chandler himself someday. Perhaps the sight of beeswax transforming into light would speak to something essential in him. And perhaps, Edmund thought with a quiet contentment, that would be a good thing. The afternoon light had shifted again, moving gradually toward the golden quality of late winter afternoon. The fire in the hearth continued its steady warmth. The molds hung in their perfect row, receiving their layers of golden wax. The rhythm continued, unhurried and eternal, the same rhythm that had continued for decades, that would continue after Edmund was gone. He dipped again and again and again. The bell for none rang across the monastery grounds, marking the middle of the afternoon. Brother Edmund heard it distantly, a gentle reminder of the passage of time rather than an urgent call. He had permission to remain at his work during the offices, and he used this freedom to move deeper into his craft as the day progressed. The second batch of candles had cooled sufficiently now. He carefully removed them from their molds, handling each one with the tenderness one might show a newborn creature. The molds released their contents reluctantly, requiring a gentle twist and a careful slide rather than any forceful extraction. Edmund had learned this patience long ago. Rushing the removal would mar the perfect surface he had worked to create. Each candle emerged unmarred, its surface glossy and smooth, its color a consistent pale gold from top to bottom. He set them upright on the cooling shelf, arranging them in precise rows. There was a quiet satisfaction in this moment, the moment when potential became reality. These candles exist now. They were no longer a possibility but an accomplished fact. The workshop had grown even warmer as the afternoon deepened. The fire burned steadily, and the accumulated heat of hours of work had transformed the chandlery into a haven of gentle warmth. Outside, Edmund knew, the winter afternoon was growing cold again as the sun moved toward the western hills. But here, in this room, There was only the comfortable heat of the work, the scent of beeswax and honey, the soft orange glow of the fire reflected in golden surfaces. He began preparing the third batch, measuring the wax with the same precision he had maintained all day. His movements had become even more economical as the hours passed, each gesture refined by decades of repetition into its most essential form. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. His body simply performed the actions it knew so completely that thought seemed almost superfluous. Yet Edmund's mind was not empty. As his hands worked, his thoughts drifted in the way they did during the most meditative moments of prayer. He found himself remembering the first candles he had ever made decades ago when his hands were younger and his understanding was still incomplete. He had made mistakes then, candles that had dripped unevenly, batches that had burned too hot and darkened, wicks that had been insufficiently soaked in rendered fat and had sputtered and smoked. Brother Cuthbert had never scolded him for these failures. Instead, the old chandler had simply melted the failed candles back down and had them made again. "The wax remembers nothing," Cuthbert had once said. "It returns to possibility each time. This is a blessing, young brother. We are all like that, perhaps, always able to be remade, always able to return to our essential nature and begin again." Edmund had thought of those words countless times over the years. They had sustained him through moments of discouragement, through times when his hands ached or his eyes grew tired, or the weight of routine threatened to become merely habitual rather than meaningful. Now, as he dipped the wicks for the third batch, he carried that wisdom in his movements. Each candle was a small act of faith, a small prayer made physical. Each one would burn. Each one would provide light. Each one would serve the community that sustained him and gave him purpose. A small sound came from the doorway. Edmund looked up briefly and saw that Brother Thomas had returned. The young monk stood hesitantly at the threshold, clearly uncertain whether to enter or merely observe from without. "Come in," Edmund said, gesturing with his free hand while his mother continued its practiced motion. "The warmth is welcome to anyone on an afternoon such as this." Brother Thomas stepped inside gratefully, and Edmund noted the boy's slight shiver as the warmth enveloped him. The young monk moved to the same spot where he had stood earlier, near the wall, respecting the unspoken boundary between observation and intrusion. For a time they worked in silence, Edmund dipping, waiting, dipping again, Brother Thomas simply watching, his eyes following the repetitive motion, his body gradually relaxing in the comfortable heat. "Brother Edmund," Thomas said finally, his voice tentative, "does this work ever become wearying? You have been at this task since before dawn, and you will likely continue until the light fails." Edmund considered the question with the same care he brought to all matters. It was not an idle inquiry. There was genuine wonder in the boy's voice, a real desire to understand whether there was meaning in the kind of work that could not be rushed, that could not be completed quickly, that demanded patience as its first requirement. "Wearying," Edmund repeated thoughtfully. "The body grows tired, yes. My back is not as straight as it was in youth, and my hands require the warmth of this room to maintain their flexibility. But wearying to the spirit? No, brother, I do not find that to be true." He paused in his dipping, holding one candle aloft, letting the light from the workshop lamps glow through its translucent surface. "Consider," he continued, "that every flame that burns in this monastery was created by these hands. Every moment of prayer that occurs in the darkness, it occurs in light that I have provided. The abbot reads documents by candlelight that I have made. The ill in the infirmary find comfort in flames that began as blocks of wax and wick. Is that wearying, or is that a privilege beyond measure?" Brother Thomas's eyes grew thoughtful, and Edmund could see him turning the words over in his mind, testing them against his own experience of monastery life. "I have not yet found such purpose in my work," Thomas admitted quietly. "I need bread, yes, and the bread feeds the community. But any brother could do what I do. There is nothing that marks my work as particular to me." Edmund nodded slowly. He remembered this feeling, the sense that one's tasks were interchangeable, that one could be replaced by any other pair of hands. It was a difficult time in monastic life, the period when a young brother had not yet discovered the particular gift or vocation that would make his presence irreplaceable. "That feeling will pass," Edmund said with quiet confidence. "Or it may not. Some brothers serve the community best precisely by doing work that any could do, by accepting the anonymity of their labor and finding holiness in that acceptance. But others, like perhaps yourself, are meant for something more particular. You must remain open to recognizing it when it comes." He returned to his dipping, and Thomas watched in silence for a time longer. Then, as the afternoon light continued its slow shift toward evening, the young monk spoke again. "Brother Edmund, may I ask you something more direct?" "You may ask anything, brother. Whether I have enough answers to satisfy, I cannot promise, but I will try." "When you look at a candle you have made," Thomas asked slowly, "do you see it as finished, or do you see it as having yet more to accomplish?" Edmund smiled. It was the question of a soul seeking meaning, seeking continuity between present labor and future purpose. It was the question that separated those who would find peace in monastic life from those who would struggle against it. "Both," Edmund said. "Each candle I make is a complete thing. It is perfect in itself, finished and ready for its purpose. But it is also incomplete, for its true purpose comes only when it is lit, when it burns, when it transforms itself into light. I make the candles, brother, but the candles make the light, and it is the light that matters." Brother Thomas stood quietly, absorbing these words. Edmund could see the young monk beginning to understand something essential, beginning to grasp the way that small tasks fit into larger patterns, the way that individual effort contributed to communal purpose. The afternoon was settling into that golden hour that came just before evening. The sun had moved low enough that its light came through the high windows at a different angle, illuminating dust motes that drifted through the chandelier like small, bright spirits. Edmund set down his current batch of candles to cool and began the process of cleaning his workspace. This too was meditative work, wiping the work table free of scattered wax, returning the molds to their precise positions on the shelf, checking the fire to ensure it would burn steadily through the evening hours. Brother Thomas observed this as well, and Edmund noted with approval that the young monk was beginning to understand that the work was not only in the making of candles. The work included the care of the workspace, the maintenance of tools, the attention to every small element that made excellence possible. "Will you come to the evening offices?" Edmund asked as he worked. "Yes, brother. The bell for Vespers will ring soon." "Good, go then and pray. But come back tomorrow if you wish. I will be beginning the special candles for the bishop then, and it is work that requires extra care. If you are truly interested in understanding this craft, you may observe more closely." Brother Thomas's face brightened with an emotion that Edmund recognized as profound gratitude mixed with hope. The young monk bowed respectfully and moved toward the door. "Thank you, Brother Edmund," Thomas said. "I will return tomorrow." After the young monk had left, Edmund finished his cleaning and stood for a moment, simply looking around the chandelier. The candles he had made that day sat in their neat rows on the cooling shelves, ready to serve. The fire burned steadily. The molds hung in their perfect arrangement. Everything was in its place. Everything was ready. He thought of Brother Cuthbert, who had stood in this same room for 40 years before Edmund had arrived. And before Cuthbert, there had been another chandler, and before him, another. The work continued, passing from one pair of hands to another, generation after generation of monks creating light for the community. Perhaps Brother Thomas would become that next generation. Perhaps the young monk would discover that this quiet craft, this patient transformation of wax into light, was exactly what his soul required. Or perhaps he would find his calling elsewhere. Either way, Edmund had done what he could to open the door, to show the young brother that there was meaning here, in the deliberate work of creating light. The bell for Vespers began to ring across the monastery grounds. Edmund extinguished his own lamp and made his way toward the door. Tomorrow he will return to this room. Tomorrow he will begin the special candles for the bishop. Tomorrow Brother Thomas would come to watch and learn. But for now, it was time to pray, to join his voice with the voices of his brothers in the great stone church, to praise the God who had given him hands for this work and a heart to find joy in it. The evening offices concluded with the soft chanting of Compline, the final prayer of the day. Brother Edmund knelt in the dimness of the great church, his voice joining the other voices in the ancient words that had been sung in this monastery for more than 300 years. Around him, the beeswax candles he had made burned steadily, their flames unwavering, casting dancing light across the stone arches and the faces of his brothers. He thought of the candles as he prayed, thought of how each one represented a small commitment he had made to excellence, to care, to the idea that even the smallest light matters in the darkness. The candles burned themselves away in service, asking nothing in return, simply providing their steady illumination until they were consumed entirely. There was something profoundly holy in that, Edmund reflected. The candles were small sacrifices, wax transformed into flame, matter becoming light, the finite becoming temporarily infinite. After Compline, the monks filed out of the church in silence, maintaining the great silence that began after the final office and would not break until after prime the following morning. This, too, was a rhythm Edmund loved. the way that the monastery moved into quietness as the night deepened, the way that silence became a kind of companion to the darkness. He made his way through the cold corridors to the dormitory, his bare feet making no sound on the ancient stone floors. The dormitory was vast and cold, lined with narrow beds, each one separated from its neighbors by a simple wooden screen. Edmund had slept in the same bed for 23 years, in the same corner of the dormitory, his body wearing an imperceptible groove into the mattress of straw and wool. He prepared for sleep as he always did, removing his outer robes and folding them carefully. The night was bitterly cold, and he drew his wool blanket up to his chin. The dormitory was lit by a single beeswax candle that burned steadily in its wall sconce, placed there so that the monks could find their way if necessary during the night hours. Edmund watched the candle's flame for a moment before closing his eyes. Even now, in the darkness of the dormitory, his mind could not entirely release from thoughts of his craft. He found himself considering the work that lay ahead. Tomorrow, he will begin the special candles for the bishop. 20 candles, each one requiring the utmost care, each one representing the monastery's respect for its visiting dignitary. He had already decided on the approach. These would be larger than the standard candles, requiring more beeswax and more time in the dipping process. The surface would be polished to an extraordinary smoothness, buffed gently with soft cloth to achieve a subtle sheen that would catch light beautifully. The wicks would be the finest quality, soaked in rendered fat that Edmund had rendered himself from the monastery's best beef stock, creating wicks that would burn clean and bright. These candles would take time, far more time than the ordinary daily candles, but Edmund did not mind. Time was one of the few things a monk had in abundance. The monastery moved by a different clock than the world outside, measured not in urgent tasks completed, but in steady, faithful progression from one office to another, from one season to another, from one year to the next. He drifted toward sleep, his body warm beneath the blankets, the dormitory quiet around him. His last conscious thought was of Brother Thomas's face as the young monk had realized that there was meaning in the small work, that a life devoted to craft and care was not a diminished life, but a full one. Sleep came gently, as it always did after a full day of purposeful work. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute when Edmund woke. He did not need light to know the time. His body had learned, over decades, to wake a few moments before the bell for matins would ring. He lay quietly for a moment, feeling the cold of the dormitory, listening to the sleeping sounds of his brothers around him. The bell rang, and Edmund rose with the ease of long practice. He dressed in the darkness, his fingers finding the familiar cloth of his outer robes, pulling them on with movements so practiced they required no conscious thought. Around him, other monks were rising as well, the dormitory filling with the quiet sounds of preparation. The walk to the great church was cold and dark. Edmund's feet found the familiar path without thought, past the cloister, across the small courtyard to the heavy wooden doors of the church. The church was warmer than the exterior corridors, though still cold enough that his breath was visible in the candlelight. Matins was the longest office, the service where the monks chanted psalms and lessons in the darkness before dawn. Edmund's voice carried the familiar melodies, his mind settling into that particular state of peaceful focus that prayer brought. The words he had sung countless times before became almost like breath, natural and necessary, requiring no conscious effort. But beneath the prayer, his mind was already in the candlery. He was thinking about the day's work ahead, planning the precise sequence of steps that would create the bishop's candles. It was not a distraction from his prayer. He had long ago learned. It was simply the way his mind worked, capable of holding prayer and planning simultaneously, capable of honoring both his spiritual devotion and his craft. After matins concluded, Edmund made his way not to the refectory for the small breakfast provided before prime, but directly to the chandlery. He had special permission for this, granted by the abbot years ago, understanding that Edmund's work often required him to begin before the other monks had fully awakened. The chandelier was cold in the pre-dawn darkness. Edmund carefully rekindled the fire, using the small burning coal he kept banked in clay to ensure the flames would start easily. The fire caught and began to grow, flames dancing upward, heat beginning to spread through the room. As the fire grew, Edmund prepared his workspace. He removed the largest molds from their storage shelf, the ones he used only for special projects. These molds were older than any of the others, relics from the time of Brother Cuthbert, perhaps even from the chandler who had served before him. They were carved from wood that had been seasoned for decades, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of careful use. He weighed out the beeswax with extraordinary care. For the bishop's candles, he would use only the finest wax, the most perfectly rendered stock. He had been saving the best of the year's bee harvest for exactly this purpose, knowing that important guests would come, and that he would need to create candles worthy of the respect they deserved. The wax melted slowly as the fire grew hotter. Edmund prepared the wicks with equal care, soaking them in the rendered fat he had prepared himself, ensuring that each one would be perfect. He had twisted these wicks himself, pairing thin strands of rush fiber, creating implements that would burn with a steady, bright flame. By the time the bell for prime rang across the monastery grounds, Edmund had completed his preparations. Everything was ready. The wax had melted to the perfect temperature, warm enough to flow smoothly but not so hot as to scald. The wicks were prepared. The molds awaited their work. He heard the soft knock at the door before prime had even finished ringing. Brother Thomas stood in the doorway, his young face eager and slightly uncertain. "I did not know if you truly meant for me to come today," Thomas said quietly, "but I found myself drawn here anyway. I hope I do not intrude." Edmund gestured to the young monk inside. "You do not intrude. Come, stand here. Today you will see work that is somewhat different from what I showed you yesterday. Today we create something for someone beyond our monastery walls, and this requires a different quality of attention." He began the first dipping, moving with even more deliberate slowness than he had used the previous day. He paused between each dipping, allowing the wax to set more fully, ensuring that each layer would bond perfectly with the one beneath it. "When we make candles for our own use," Edmund explained quietly, "we make them well and they serve their purpose faithfully. But when we create candles for one who does not know our work, who has not yet learned to trust the quality of our craft, we must make them with an even greater level of care. These candles will speak for our monastery. They will represent us. Do you understand? Brother Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, brother, I think I am beginning to. Good, then watch carefully. Today I will teach you more than I taught you yesterday. And so the day began, Edmund moving through his craft with Brother Thomas watching intently, learning not just the techniques of chandlery, but the philosophy that underlay it. The young monk observed how Edmund tested the temperature of the wax with subtle adjustments, how he positioned each candle in the molds with precise care, how every movement was intentional and purposeful. By the time the bell for sext rang at midday, the first batch of the bishop's candles had begun to take form. They were larger than the standard candles, their surfaces already showing the extraordinary smoothness that Edmund's careful technique had created. Even in their unfinished state, they bore witness to the quality of craft that had gone into their creation. Edmund set them aside to cool gradually, knowing that rushing this process would create hairline cracks in the wax. Patience, as always, was essential. Brother Thomas, Edmund said, I am going to the refectory now for the midday meal. You should go as well. This work requires both nourishment and rest. We will return after none to continue. The young monk hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave the warmth and the work. But he bowed respectfully and followed Edmund out of the chandlery into the cold afternoon. In the refectory, they sat in silence as was the custom, listening to one of the younger monks read aloud from the lives of the saints. Edmund ate his simple meal of barley porridge and bread, barely tasting it, his mind already returning to the work ahead. Brother Thomas sat nearby, eating slowly, his eyes distant, and Edmund could see that the young monk's thoughts were also on the candlery, on the candles that were slowly taking form. The afternoon work proceeded with the same careful deliberation as the morning had. Edmund and Brother Thomas returned to the chandlery after none, and the dipping continued. Layer by layer, the candles grew, each one receiving the patient attention that they required. Brother Thomas watched intently, and Edmund found himself explaining more than he had intended. He talked about the way beeswax responded to temperature, about how the quality of the molds affected the final product, about the importance of consistency in every step of the process. Why do you share all of this? Thomas asked at one point, his voice carrying genuine wonder. You could simply make the candles yourself. You do not require my observation. Edmund paused in his work, considering the question. I share this, he said slowly, because one day, perhaps soon, I will be too old to do this work. My hands will fail me, my eyes will dim. When that time comes, someone must be ready to continue. And more than that, brother, I share this because I have been given much knowledge by those who came before me. It would be a betrayal of their gift if I did not pass it forward. Brother Thomas absorbed these words, and Edmund saw something shift in the young monk's bearing, a kind of settling, as though something that had been uncertain was now becoming clear. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Edmund brought out the polishing clothes. The first batch of candles from that morning had cooled sufficiently now to receive the final treatment. With extraordinary gentleness, he began to buff each candle's surface, creating a subtle sheen that caught the light beautifully. "Watch how I do this," Edmund instructed. "The cloth must be soft, the pressure must be light. You are not forcing anything. You are simply encouraging the natural beauty of the wax to emerge. The wax itself knows what it should be. We are merely helping it become that." Brother Thomas leaned closer, watching as Edmund's weathered hands moved across the candle's surface in gentle, circular motions. The transformation was subtle but profound. As the polishing continued, the candle seemed to come alive, its surface developing a luminous quality that had not been apparent before. "It is beautiful," Thomas whispered. "Yes," Edmund agreed. "It is. And that beauty comes not from decoration or artifice. It comes simply from the careful attention to the essential nature of the material. When we work in accordance with what the wax wishes to become, rather than against it, beauty emerges naturally." The bell for Vespers rang as Edmund was polishing the fifth candle. He carefully set down his work and prepared to depart for evening prayer. Brother Thomas moved to follow him, but Edmund placed a gentle hand on the young monk's shoulder. "Before you go," Edmund said, "I want to give you something." He moved to a shelf in the back of the chandelier and retrieved one of the imperfect candles he had set aside earlier. It was slightly thinner than the others, a small flaw in the mold having affected its shape, but it was nonetheless a beautiful candle, made of fine beeswax, capable of burning with a steady, bright flame. "This is for you," Edmund said, placing it in Brother Thomas's hands. "Take it to the dormitory. Light it when you study or read. Let it remind you that imperfection does not diminish usefulness. And let it remind you that there is meaning in light, in beauty, in the small work done carefully." Brother Thomas looked down at the candle, and Edmund could see tears gathering in the young monk's eyes. The gift was simple, but he understood that it carried far more weight than its material form suggested. "Thank you, Brother Edmund," Thomas said softly. "I will treasure it." The two monks departed the chandlery together, moving through the cold corridors toward the great church. Behind them, the fire burned steadily in the chandelier, and the candles sat in their neat rows, waiting for completion, waiting to fulfill their purpose, waiting to become light. The next several days unfolded in a rhythm that became almost hypnotic in its steadiness. Brother Edmund rose before matins, worked through the morning hours in the chandlery, attended the offices with his brothers, and then returned to his craft each afternoon. Brother Thomas had become a constant presence, arriving each day to observe, to learn, to slowly begin to understand the deeper philosophy that underlay the simple act of making candles. The bishop's candles grew in number and perfection. By the middle of the week, Edmund had completed 12 of the 20 required. Each one had been polished to extraordinary smoothness. Each one bore the unmistakable mark of a master craftsman's hand. They sat in a special cabinet that Edmund had prepared, protected from dust and drafts, awaiting their moment of purpose. It was on the 5th day that Brother Thomas asked if he might attempt to make a candle himself. Edmund had been expecting this request. He had seen it coming in the careful way the young monk watched his hands. in the way Thomas's fingers had begun to mirror Edmund's movements, as though his body was learning the craft before his conscious mind fully understood it. "Not yet," Edmund said gently. "You are not ready. Watch for 3 more weeks. Then we will begin your training in earnest." Thomas looked disappointed, but he accepted the answer without complaint. Edmund understood the hunger in the young monk's expression. It was the hunger of a soul recognizing its purpose, the need to begin doing what one was born to do. "Why 3 weeks?" Thomas asked. Edmund smiled. "Because there is more to learn before your hands touch the wax. You must learn to see as Chandler sees. You must understand the behavior of the materials, the way temperature affects quality, the way patience affects results. You must learn the rhythm, the way that haste is the enemy of excellence. 3 weeks of careful observation will prepare you in ways that I cannot yet explain in words." Brother Thomas accepted this wisdom without argument, returning to his role as observer with renewed dedication. The week progressed toward its end. Friday came, and with it a change in the weather. The snow that had blanketed the monastery for weeks began to soften, and rain fell gently but persistently throughout the day. The moisture in the air made Edmund's work slightly more difficult, requiring subtle adjustments to his process to account for the changes in humidity. But he had worked in all seasons for so many years that these adjustments came almost without conscious thought. It was after Vespers on Friday evening that the abbot appeared at the chandlery door. Abbot Thomas was an elderly man, nearly as old as Brother Edmund himself, though his bearing remained upright and his mind sharp. He had guided the monastery with wisdom and gentle firmness for 22 years, and Edmund had come to respect him deeply during that time. "Brother Edmund," the abbot said, his voice carrying the careful courtesy he showed to all his monks, "I have come to see the bishop's candles. Word has reached me that they are progressing well." "Come in, abbot," Edmund said, gesturing toward the warming fire. "They are nearly complete. I have finished 12, and I am working toward the full complement of 20. The abbot moved to the cabinet where the finished candles rested and examined them carefully, holding one up to the lamplight, observing the quality of the wax, the precision of the work. "These are extraordinary," Abbot Thomas said quietly. "Brother Edmund, you have outdone yourself. The bishop will be deeply impressed." "I have only done what the work required," Edmund said, and he meant it. He had never considered his craft as something separate from his spiritual life. The excellence of the candles was not a personal achievement, but rather a result of aligning his efforts with what the work itself demanded. "I have come with a request," the abbot continued. "Brother Thomas, the novice in the bakery, has spoken to me about his desire to learn your craft. He says you have promised to begin his training in 3 weeks' time." "That is correct, Abbot. He shows aptitude and genuine calling. I believe he has the temperament required for this work." The abbot nodded slowly. "That is my assessment as well, but I came to tell you something. Brother Cuthbert, who trained you, left the monastery 30 years ago to found a new monastery in the north. He is now quite elderly, but he still maintains his chandlery. I have received word that he is seeking a successor, someone who can carry forward his work after he is gone. The other monastery in Yorkshire has written requesting that I send them a skilled chandler." Edmund felt something stir in his chest, a complex emotion composed of pride and sadness, and a kind of bittersweet recognition. "They are requesting you specifically," the abbot continued. "Brother Cuthbert has written that he would like to train you further, to pass along knowledge that he did not have time to teach during your apprenticeship years. He offers you the position of Master Chandler in the Yorkshire house, with the understanding that you would eventually train a successor there." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. The request was an honor beyond measure. To return to Yorkshire, to study under the master who had taught him, to establish himself as the chief craftsman in a monastery he had never seen but had long imagined from Cuthbert's stories. It was a calling that spoke to something deep in his soul. But at the same time, it would mean leaving this monastery where he had spent the last 30 years, leaving the rhythm he had established, leaving Brother Thomas at the very moment when the young monk was beginning to find his way. "What do you require of me, Abbot?" Edmund asked. "I require nothing," the abbot said gently. "This is a choice that you must make, but I wanted you to know that the option exists. If you wish to go, you have my blessing. If you wish to remain here, that is equally blessed. I offer you the knowledge of your options and trust that you will discern correctly." The abbot placed a gentle hand on Edmund's shoulder and departed, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his craft. Edmund did not make a hasty decision. Instead, he carried the question within himself as he continued his work, letting it settle into the depths of his being, waiting to see what wisdom might emerge. Saturday brought him no clarity. He completed 3 more of the bishop's candles, worked through the offices, and moved through the day in a kind of suspended state, his body performing its familiar tasks while his mind remained elsewhere. It was not until Sunday, during the long office of Mass, that something shifted. Edmund found himself thinking of Brother Cuthbert not as he had known him in his youth, but as Cuthbert must be now, an old man, still working, still creating candles for a monastery in Yorkshire, still carrying the knowledge that had been passed to him by his own predecessors. Every master craftsman eventually faced this question, Edmund realized. At what point did one pass the torch to the next generation? At what point did it become more important to preserve the knowledge, to ensure its continuity, than to continue working oneself? And then he thought of Brother Thomas, standing in the chandlery, watching with intense focus, beginning to understand that there was meaning in light, beginning to recognize his calling. Thomas was ready to learn. Thomas had been sent to him by Providence for exactly this purpose. But there was also Brother Cuthbert in Yorkshire, elderly and alone, seeking to pass forward the knowledge that would die with him if no one came to receive it. Edmund remained in the church long after the other monks had departed, kneeling in the dimness, surrounded by the candles he had made, thinking about the interconnected web of craft and responsibility, and calling that extended through generations of monks, reaching backward to those who had taught him and forward to those he would teach. It was only as he was leaving the church that the answer came to him, suddenly and completely, with the clarity of something that had always been true, and he was only now recognizing it. He found the abbot in his study. "Abbot Thomas," Edmund said, "I have made my decision. I wish to remain here at this monastery, but I have a proposal." The abbot gestured for him to sit. "I am listening, Brother Edmund." "Send word to Brother Cuthbert," Edmund said. "Tell him that I cannot come to Yorkshire, but tell him also that I am training my successor here. Tell him that when Brother Thomas is ready, perhaps in 2 or 3 years, I will send the young monk to study with him, to carry forward what Cuthbert knows, to establish the chandlery in Yorkshire with the finest training available." Edmund paused, letting the idea fully form as he spoke it aloud. "In this way," he continued, "the knowledge passes forward through both of us. I remain here where I have roots, where my community needs me. Brother Thomas receives the training in both Yorkshire and here, becoming a bridge between the 2 monasteries. And Brother Cuthbert receives a successor who has already been trained in the fundamentals, so that his remaining years can be devoted to the highest refinements of the craft. All 3 of us serve the continuation of excellence across generations." The abbot was quiet for a long moment. Then a smile emerged slowly across his weathered face. "That is a beautiful solution, Brother Edmund. It honors all the connections that bind us together. Let me write to Brother Cuthbert immediately. I believe he will find this arrangement deeply satisfying." Edmund departed the abbot's study feeling something he had not expected to feel. A sense of peace that was even deeper than what he normally experienced in his craft. He had been given a choice, and in choosing to remain, he had somehow managed to serve a larger purpose than if he had gone. Over the following weeks, the bishop's candles were completed. All 20 of them sat in their cabinet, polished to extraordinary brilliance, each one a small masterpiece of craft and care. Edmund had created them not with the intensity of someone proving something, but with the quiet dedication of someone fulfilling exactly what needed to be fulfilled. Brother Thomas continued his daily observations, and Edmund began to teach him more explicitly. He showed the young monk how to test the temperature of wax using only the sensitivity of one's fingertip. He demonstrated the subtle adjustments required when humidity changed. He explained the philosophy behind each movement, so that Thomas would eventually understand not just how to make candles, but why each step was essential. The rain of early winter gave way to the crystalline cold of deep winter. Snow began to fall again, gentle and persistent, covering the monastery grounds in white. The chandlery remained warm, a refuge from the cold, a place where the ancient rhythms of craft continued undisturbed by the turning seasons. One afternoon, as the winter light was beginning to fade early into dusk, Brother Thomas asked Edmund a question that seemed to draw together everything they had been discussing. "Brother Edmund," Thomas said, "when I make candles, who do I make them for?" Edmund considered the question carefully. "You make them for everyone who will see their light," he said finally. "You make them for the monks who will pray by their flame, for the abbot who will read by their illumination, for the sick in the infirmary who will find comfort in their glow, for the bishop who will understand by their quality the care that this monastery brings to all things. But most importantly, you make them for the light itself, for the transformation of matter into flame, for the privilege of creating something that serves a purpose beyond your own understanding. Brother Thomas nodded slowly, and Edmund could see that the young monk was beginning to grasp something essential about the work, something that could not be taught in words, but only discovered through the patient practice of the craft itself. That evening after Compline, Edmund sat alone in the candlery for a moment, looking around at the workspace that had been his home for 3 decades. He thought of Brother Cuthbert, who had sat in a chandlery in Yorkshire, creating candles just as Edmund did. He thought of the chandler who had come before Cuthbert, and the one before him, stretching backward through centuries of monks, all of them devoted to the same simple task, transforming beeswax into light. And he thought of Brother Thomas, who would sit in this room after him, and perhaps of another monk after Thomas, the knowledge continuing to pass forward, generation after generation, each one adding their own refinement and understanding to the craft. The fire in the hearth burned steadily, casting its familiar warmth through the workshop. Edmund rose and moved to the shelf where he kept his finest molds, the ones carved by his own hand, refined through years of practice. These too would pass to Brother Thomas, and someday, perhaps, to another monk who would discover the calling to create light. He thought of the candles burning now throughout the monastery, in the great church, in the abbot's study, in the infirmary. Each one was performing its purpose faithfully, burning itself away in service, asking nothing in return except to be lit. There was a profound wisdom in that, Edmund reflected. There was a way of being that the candles understood perfectly, the way of serving without attachment to the service, of transforming oneself without complaint, of providing light without expectation of gratitude. Tomorrow he will return to this room and continue his work. Tomorrow Brother Thomas will arrive to watch and learn. Tomorrow the rhythm would continue, as it had continued for centuries, as it would continue for centuries yet to come. But for now, Edmund simply stood in the warming glow of the firelight, surrounded by the tools of his trade, and felt a gratitude so profound that it seemed to transcend words entirely. Winter deepened around the monastery, and with it came a particular quality of stillness that Edmund had come to treasure over his decades of living within these walls. The snow fell more frequently now, accumulating on the stone roofs and in the corners of the cloister, creating a landscape of white and shadow that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. Brother Thomas had been training formally for 6 weeks now, and the transformation in the young monk was remarkable to witness. Thomas had moved beyond mere observation and had begun to work with the wax under Edmund's careful guidance. His first attempts had been clumsy, his hands uncertain, his movements hesitant. But Edmund had seen this before, the way that the body slowly learned what the mind could not entirely grasp through words alone. "Again," Edmund said gently, watching as Brother Thomas prepared to dip a wick for perhaps the 100th time that week. "Feel the temperature of the wax with your fingertip first. Your body will know when it is correct, long before your mind catches up." Thomas dipped his finger delicately into the golden liquid, and his face showed the concentration of one learning to read a new language written in sensation, rather than words. "Yes," Edmund encouraged. "You feel it now, the wick." Thomas lifted the prepared wick and dipped it into the melted wax with slightly more confidence than his previous attempts. The coating adhered smoothly, and when he withdrew the wick, a thin layer of golden wax clung to it, perfect and even. "Good," Edmund said. "That is good work, brother. Continue, and remember, you are not rushing toward completion. You are moving toward excellence. The completion will come naturally if you maintain your focus on the quality of each moment." Brother Thomas nodded, and Edmund could see the young monk settling into the rhythm, his breathing slowing, his movements becoming more deliberate and assured. This was the moment when true learning began, when the body started to remember what the mind had been trying to understand. The chandlery had become a place of double rhythm now. Edmund continued his own work on commissions and the monastery's regular candle needs, while simultaneously giving space and attention to Brother Thomas's early efforts. It would have been inefficient to work this way in the secular world, but in the monastery, efficiency was not the highest value. Learning, continuity, the faithful passing forward of knowledge, these were the measures by which success was truly reckoned. One evening, after Thomas had completed his work for the day and had departed for vespers, Edmund stood looking at the candles the young monk had made. They were imperfect, certainly. Some bore slight variations in thickness. A few showed minute bubbles in the wax where air had been trapped during the dipping. But they were also unmistakably the work of someone who was learning, who was beginning to understand, who carried within him the potential to become a true master of the craft. Edmund carefully saved each of Thomas's candles, setting them in a special row on a shelf. He was not preserving them out of sentiment, though there was that element. Rather, he was preserving them as a record of progress, a way for Brother Thomas to see his own improvement over time. It was important, Edmund had learned, for a student to recognize how far they had come, to see evidence of their own growth. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to the monastery. Brother Cuthbert's letter had arrived just before Christmas, carried by a traveling merchant who passed through the region. In it, the elderly chandler had responded to Edmund's proposal with gratitude and enthusiasm. He had agreed that training Brother Thomas to eventually come to Yorkshire was an excellent plan. But he had also written something more. He was planning to travel to Edmund's monastery in the spring, hoping to spend a month working alongside his former student, reconnecting with the community, and offering his own wisdom to the young apprentice who would eventually carry the craft forward in his own monastery. The letter had filled Edmund with a complex emotion, part joy at the prospect of seeing his old master, part apprehension about how the encounter might unfold after so many years of separation, part anticipation about what Cuthbert might teach both him and Brother Thomas. Now, in late January, as the winter began to show its first subtle signs of weakening, Edmund found himself frequently returning to Cuthbert's letter, rereading it, trying to envision how the old master's presence might transform the work of the chandelier. It was during one of these reflections that Brother Thomas asked Edmund a question that showed how deeply the young monk had come to understand the philosophy underlying the craft. "Brother Edmund," Thomas said, pausing in his work one afternoon, "you told me once that I make candles not just for those who use them, but for the light itself. but I confess I still do not fully understand what you meant. How does one serve light? How does one make something for something that does not have wants or needs?" Edmund set down his own work and turned to face the young monk fully. This was an important moment, a moment when understanding could deepen significantly if the right words could be found. "Come," Edmund said, gesturing toward the window. "It is late afternoon and the light will be beginning to change. Let us observe for a moment." Together, they stood at the narrow window of the chandlery, looking out across the monastery grounds. The sun was descending toward the western hills, its light growing increasingly golden. The snow that covered the courtyard began to glow with the warmth of that descending light, and every surface that caught the rays seemed to transform, to become luminous. "What do you see?" Edmund asked. "I see beauty," Brother Thomas said slowly. "I see light changing everything it touches." "Yes," Edmund agreed. "And what does the light require of you to create that beauty?" Brother Thomas was silent for a moment, thinking. "Nothing," he said finally. "The light does not require anything. It simply is. It does what it does without needing anything from me." "Exactly so," Edmund said. "The light does not need our candles to exist. The sun rises whether we make candles or not, but we create candles because we recognize that light in all its forms serves a purpose larger than itself. Light illuminates, light reveals, light comforts those who are afraid of darkness. Light makes possible all the work that monks do, the reading, the copying of manuscripts, the prayer in the darkened church." He turned from the window to look at Brother Thomas directly. "When I say that you make candles for light itself, I mean that you are serving the principle of light. You are participating in light's work. By creating candles, you extend light's reach. You allow light to continue its work in the hours when the sun has set. You are not the creator of light, brother. You are merely a small instrument through which light continues to do what it has always done, to reveal, to comfort, to guide." Brother Thomas's eyes grew distant as he absorbed these words, and Edmund could see the young monk beginning to grasp something that could not be taught in any other way. The way that individual work could participate in purposes far larger than the individual worker. "So when I make a candle," Thomas said slowly, "I am not making it for a particular person. I am making it so that light can continue its work." "Yes," Edmund said, "and when that candle burns in the church during matins, it does exactly what it was created to do. It provides light so that prayer can occur. But it does so without pride, without expectation of thanks. It burns itself away completely, asking nothing in return. That is the lesson the candles teach us if we pay attention. That is the philosophy of the craft." The weeks progressed into early February, and the monastery began to prepare for the arrival of Brother Cuthbert. Rooms were cleaned and prepared. The abbot wrote to confirm the dates of the visit. Edmund found himself in a state of heightened anticipation that was both energizing and slightly unsettling. He had not seen Brother Cuthbert in 30 years. In that time, Edmund himself had aged from a mature man in his middle years to an elder approaching the final decades of life. His hands had grown more weathered. His eyes had weakened slightly. His movements had gradually slowed. He wondered how much Cuthbert would have changed. wondered if the old master would be disappointed to see how Edmund's craft, while still excellent, had perhaps begun to show subtle signs of the aging process. But there was no use in worrying about such things. The spring would arrive when it arrived. Brother Cuthbert would come or not come according to God's will and the vagaries of travel. Edmund could only continue his work, continue training Brother Thomas, and wait with patient acceptance for whatever the future held. It was in the midst of this waiting that something unexpected happened. On a cold morning in early February, a messenger arrived from the bishop's residence, carrying a letter for Brother Edmund. Edmund rarely received correspondence. His life was too simple, too removed from the concerns of the world beyond the monastery walls. But this letter bore the bishop's seal, and it was addressed specifically to him. With some trepidation, Edmund broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. The letter was written in an educated hand, clear and precise. To Brother Edmund, Master Chandler of the Monastery of St. Cuthbert, I am writing to express my profound appreciation for the candles you created for my recent visit to your monastery. In all my years, I have never encountered wax candles of such extraordinary quality. Every detail speaks of a mastery that goes far beyond mere technical skill. The candles burned steadily and brightly throughout my stay, and I found myself repeatedly nodding their excellence. I am moved to make a request. I would like to commission from you a special set of candles, 50 in total, to be used in the cathedral for our most sacred ceremonies. I would pay generously for this work, and I would be honored to display candles bearing your name. Your craft deserves to be known beyond the walls of your monastery. If you are willing to undertake this commission, please respond, and I will arrange for the necessary materials and payment. With respect and admiration, Bishop Thomas. Edmund sat with the letter for a long time after reading it, turning it over in his hands, trying to process what it meant. In his entire career as a chandler, he had never been asked to create candles for use beyond the monastery. His work had always been for the community that sustained him, for the internal needs of monastery life. The idea that his candles might be displayed in a cathedral, that they might bear his name, that he might receive payment for his work, it was almost incomprehensible. He showed the letter to the abbot later that day. Abbot Thomas read it carefully, a smile gradually spreading across his weathered face. Brother Edmund, this is a great honor. What do you wish to do? Edmund had not yet allowed himself to fully consider what he wished to do. His first instinct had been to refuse, to continue as he always had, to keep his work within the monastery where it belonged. But something in the bishop's words had touched him. The bishop had recognized something in the candles, not just technical excellence, but a kind of intention, a quality that came from making something in service to light and prayer. I wish to do it, Edmund said, surprising himself with certainty in his own voice. But I have a condition. The payment should come to the monastery, not to me personally, and I would like to train Brother Thomas to assist me with this work. This will be an opportunity for him to create candles at the highest level of the craft, and he should participate fully in the commission. The abbot nodded approvingly. This is wise, Brother Edmund. I will send word to the bishop that we accept his commission, with your conditions included." News of the bishop's commission spread through the monastery, and Edmund was surprised to discover how much his brothers valued his work. Several of them sought him out to offer congratulations. Even some of the youngest monks, who had perhaps never fully considered where the candles they used each day came from, began to understand that their brother Edmund was a craftsman of significant skill. Brother Thomas was particularly affected by the news. The young monk came to the chandelier with an expression of almost reverential seriousness. "Brother Edmund," Thomas said, "I do not know if I am ready for work at this level. 50 candles for the cathedral. This is far beyond anything I have yet attempted." "You are ready for the learning," Edmund said. "You may not yet be ready for independent work at this level, but you are ready to participate in learning. And that is the only way one ever becomes ready for more demanding work, by attempting it, making mistakes, and gradually developing the necessary skill." Edmund paused, then continued, "I will tell you something, brother. When I was first given responsibility for creating the monastery's candles after Brother Cuthbert departed, I was terrified. I felt completely unprepared. But the work itself teaches if you remain open to learning. Each candle you make will teach you something. The failures will teach you as much as the successes, perhaps more." Over the following weeks, Edmund and Brother Thomas began the extended process of creating the bishop's candles. The work proceeded with meticulous care. Edmund had ordered the finest beeswax from the most reliable sources, materials that would ensure the candles met the extraordinary standard he had set for himself. Brother Thomas participated in every stage of the work. He helped prepare the materials, test the temperatures, and prepare the wicks. And most importantly, he watched Edmund work with an intensity of focus that was almost tangible. Slowly, the bishop's candles took form. Not all 50 at once, but in batches, each batch receiving complete attention and care before moving to the next. The work would take months. It was not meant to be rushed. As February turned toward March, Edmund received word that Brother Cuthbert had begun his journey from Yorkshire. The old master would arrive sometime in April, after the worst of the spring storms had passed. The knowledge that Cuthbert was actually coming, that the long years of separation were nearing an end, created a complex emotional undercurrent that Edmund carried with him throughout his days. He found himself thinking frequently about what Cuthbert might say when he saw the chandlery as it had developed over the past 30 years. Would the old master approve of the refinements Edmund had made to the craft? Would Cuthbert see growth and development, or would he see gradual deviation from the principles he had taught? These worries were perhaps unnecessary, Edmund knew. Brother Cuthbert had written with nothing but encouragement and respect for what Edmund had accomplished, but the uncertainty remained nonetheless. It was Brother Thomas who finally asked him directly about his concerns. "Brother Edmund," the young monk said one afternoon while they were working, "you seem troubled. I have noticed it for several days now. If I am not overstepping, I wonder if something is wrong." Edmund smiled at the perceptiveness of the young monk. "Nothing is wrong, brother. It is only that change approaches, and I find myself uncertain about how it will unfold. Brother Cuthbert will arrive in a few weeks' time, and I have not seen him in 30 years. I wonder how we will be with each other after such a long separation." "Will you not be glad to see him?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Edmund said. "I will be very glad, but I will also be different from the young man he taught all those years ago. And he will be older, perhaps more fragile. I wonder if the connection we once had will still exist, or if time will have changed us both too much." Brother Thomas nodded slowly, and Edmund could see that the young monk was beginning to understand something about the nature of change and continuity, about the way that relationships existed across time in ways that were not always straightforward. "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that the connection will be in the work itself. When Brother Cuthbert sees what you have created, when he sees the candles you have made and the student you have trained, he will understand. The connection will be there in the quality of what you have done together, even though 30 years have passed." Edmund found himself quite moved by this observation. The young monk had grasped something true, that the real connection between master and student was not in the personal relationship alone, but in the continuity of craft, in the way that knowledge and skill and intention passed forward through the work itself. "You are wise beyond your years, Brother Thomas," Edmund said. "I think perhaps you are ready to begin creating candles more independently. This work with the Bishop's Commission will be an opportunity for you to demonstrate what you have learned." Brother Thomas's face lit with a combination of pride and nervousness, and Edmund felt the familiar warmth that came from seeing a student begin to recognize their own growing capability. The chandlery fell quiet again, and the two monks returned to their work, the gentle rhythm of dipping and waiting and dipping again continuing its ancient pattern, unchanged for centuries, yet always new and alive in each moment of its practice. The first truly warm day of spring arrived in early April, carrying with it the scent of thawing earth and emerging life. Edmund stood in the monastery courtyard during the midday rest, feeling the sun on his face for what seemed like the first time in months. The snow had finally retreated to the shadowed corners where it lingered stubbornly, unwilling to fully surrender to the season's turning. Brother Thomas appeared at his side, slightly out of breath. "Brother Edmund, the abbot has sent word. Brother Cuthbert has arrived. He is in the guest house now, resting after his journey. The abbot requests that you come to greet him when you have finished with your work for the day." Edmund felt his heart quicken in a way that surprised him with its intensity. After so many years, after so much anticipation, the moment had finally come. Brother Cuthbert was here, within these monastery walls, just as he had been 30 years ago before his own departure to establish a new community. "Thank you, brother," Edmund said. "I will go to him after sext." The afternoon hours seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Edmund found it difficult to concentrate on his work, his hands performing their familiar motions while his mind was entirely elsewhere. Brother Thomas worked quietly beside him, and Edmund was grateful for the young monk's discretion. Thomas asked no questions, offered no commentary, simply continued the steady labor that had become second nature to both of them. When the bell for sext finally rang, Edmund carefully set down his work, washed his hands with deliberate care, and made his way to the guest house. His pace was measured, but his heart seemed to be moving far faster than his aging body could match. The guest house was a separate building from the main monastery, reserved for visitors and traveling monks. Brother Cuthbert stood in the courtyard outside it, and Edmund's first shock was at how small the old man had become. In Edmund's memory, Cuthbert had been a figure of considerable physical presence, a man whose authority was written in his bearing as much as in his skill. But the figure who turned to greet him was bent with age, his frame diminished, his hands trembling slightly with what Edmund recognized as the infirmities of advanced years. Yet when Cuthbert's eyes met Edmund's, something essential remained unchanged. The clarity, the intelligence, the warmth that Edmund remembered from his youth was still present, still burning steadily behind the weathered features. "Edmund," Brother Cuthbert said, his voice rougher than Edmund remembered but still carrying its characteristic gentleness. "You have grown old." Edmund smiled, unable to contain his emotion. "And you have traveled far, Master. I am grateful you made the journey." "Come," Cuthbert said, gesturing toward the guest house. "Let us sit. The road was long and I am not as young as I was. We have much to discuss." They settled in the guest house's simple sitting room, where a fire burned in the hearth. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply existed in each other's presence, bridging 30 years with their silence. "I have read your letters," Cuthbert said finally. "All of them over the years. I have followed your work through your words. You have done well here, Edmund, more than well. You have kept the craft alive and have elevated it." "I have had a lot of time to practice," Edmund said simply. 30 years of steady work allows for considerable refinement." "Yes," Cuthbert agreed, "but time alone does not create excellence. Time merely provides the opportunity. It is the intention brought to the work that transforms time into mastery." The old chandler leaned forward slightly. "I want to see the candlery tomorrow. I want to see what you have created, and I want to meet this student of yours. The abbot speaks very highly of Brother Thomas." "He has great potential," Edmund said. "He arrived uncertain of his vocation, but the craft has called to something essential in him. I believe he will become a fine chandler." "Good," Cuthbert said, settling back into his chair. "Then we have much work to do. I did not come here merely to visit. I came to ensure that what I know is fully passed forward, that the work continues in its fullness after I am gone." There was something in the old master's tone that communicated a sense of urgency beneath the gentleness. Edmund understood without being told that Cuthbert's health was more fragile than the old chandler wished to acknowledge, that the elderly monk was aware of his own mortality and was determined to use whatever time remained to complete the transmission of knowledge. "How long can you remain?" Edmund asked. "Until the summer," Cuthbert said. "My monastery can spare me for that long. After that, I must return to Yorkshire. But in the time I have, I want to work with you and with Brother Thomas. I want to see the bishop's candles that the abbot mentioned. I want to understand the full scope of what has been accomplished here." The following morning, Edmund guided Brother Cuthbert to the chandlery. The old master moved slowly, using a carved wooden staff that Edmund had not seen before, but his eyes were sharp as he took in every detail of the workspace. Cuthbert moved through the room with deliberate slowness, observing the arrangement of molds, the configuration of the work tables, and the organization of materials. He ran his weathered fingers along the edge of a mold, examining the craftsmanship of the carving. He held one of Edmund's finished candles up to the light, turning it slowly, observing the quality of the work. For a long time, he said nothing. Edmund waited patiently, understanding that the old master was conducting an assessment of far greater depth than mere words could convey. Finally, Cuthbert turned to face Edmund directly. "You have become a true master," Cuthbert said quietly. "I taught you the fundamentals, Edmund, but you have gone beyond what I could teach you. You have refined the craft, you have elevated it. This work is extraordinary." Edmund felt tears gathering in his eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, of the deep satisfaction that came from being truly seen by someone whose opinion mattered more than anyone else's in the world. "I have only tried to maintain what you taught me," Edmund said. "No," Cuthbert replied gently but firmly. "You have done far more than that. You have taken what I gave you and you have made it your own. You have added your own understanding, your own refinement. This is exactly what a true apprenticeship should produce. Not a copy of the master, but a student who becomes a master in their own right." Brother Thomas appeared in the doorway then, having been sent by the abbot to fetch Cuthbert for the midday meal. When he saw the two old monks together, the young monk hesitated, recognizing that something significant was occurring. "Brother Thomas," Edmund said, gesturing the young monk forward. "Come, I would like you to meet Brother Cuthbert, who trained me in this craft 30 years ago." Brother Thomas approached respectfully and bowed. Cuthbert examined him with an intensity that made the young monk slightly nervous. "You are the one with potential," Cuthbert said. "The abbot has told me about your training. Show me your hands." Brother Thomas extended his hands, and Cuthbert took them gently, examining them with the care one might show in reading an important text. He studied the texture of Thomas's skin, the length and shape of his fingers, and the way the young monk's hands held their strength. "Good hands," Cuthbert said finally, releasing them. "Sensitive hands, patient hands. Yes, I think you may indeed become a worthy chandler." The old master turned back to Edmund. "This one should come to Yorkshire with me when I return. A year under my instruction, combined with what he has already learned from you, will complete his training. After that, he will be ready to be a master in his own right." Brother Thomas's eyes widened with the magnitude of what was being proposed. Edmund could see the young monk processing the enormity of the opportunity, the honor and the challenge it represented. "Brother Thomas," Edmund asked gently, "what do you think of this proposal?" The young monk took a moment to gather his thoughts. "I am honored beyond measure, Brother Cuthbert," Thomas said carefully. "But I would not wish to abandon the work here, to abandon the community that has supported me." Cuthbert smiled, and it was a smile full of understanding. "You would not be abandoning them, young brother. You would be completing your training. 1 year in Yorkshire, learning the deepest refinements of the craft from someone who has practiced it for longer than you have been alive. And then you will return here or go wherever the church sends you, carrying the fullness of the knowledge. That is not abandonment. That is service. Will you return to our monastery afterward? Edmund asked carefully. Or will you remain in Yorkshire? Brother Thomas looked between the two older monks, understanding the weight of the choice being presented to him. I do not yet know, Thomas said honestly. I think perhaps the answer will become clear when the time comes. But yes, I believe I will go to Yorkshire. I believe I will study with Brother Cuthbert, and then I will discover where God wishes me to serve. Over the following weeks, an extraordinary rhythm established itself in the monastery. During the mornings, Edmund and Cuthbert worked together on the bishop's candles, with Brother Thomas participating fully in every stage of the process. The old master offered constant gentle corrections, suggestions, refinements. Some of these were techniques that Edmund had never learned, knowledge that Cuthbert had accumulated in the additional 30 years he had been practicing the craft. But more than the technical knowledge, there was something else that passed between the three of them during those morning hours in the chandlery. There was a kind of communion, a shared participation in something that transcended the merely practical. The three monks, separated by generations and years, were joined together in the ancient work of creating light. Edmund found himself learning things he had not expected to learn. He had thought his mastery was essentially complete, that there was little new knowledge to acquire after 30 years of consistent practice. But Cuthbert revealed subtleties that Edmund had never considered. The way that the angle at which one dipped the wick could affect how the candle burned. Minute adjustments to temperature that could influence the final texture of the wax. Philosophical insights about the relationship between the craftsman and the material that went far beyond anything Edmund had previously understood. And Brother Thomas absorbed everything with an intensity of focus that was remarkable to witness. The young monk's hands, already becoming skilled, began to incorporate Cuthbert's refinements. Under the old master's patient instruction, Thomas developed an understanding of the craft that went far deeper than mere technical skill. He was learning the philosophy, the spiritual dimension, the way that creating candles was ultimately an act of prayer and service. It was during the third week of Cuthbert's stay that something significant occurred. Edmund and Cuthbert were working together on one of the bishop's candles, a particularly challenging piece, where Edmund was attempting a new technique for creating a subtle gradient in the wax's color by mixing different batches at slightly different temperatures. The attempt was failing. The gradient was too abrupt, the transition between colors too harsh. Edmund set the ruined candle aside with a sigh of frustration. "It cannot be done this way," he said. "I have been attempting this approach for 3 days, and each time the result is unsatisfactory." Cuthbert examined the failed candle carefully. "You are approaching it with too much intention," the old master said thoughtfully. "You are trying to force the wax to do what you wish. Instead, you must ask the wax what it wishes to become, and then cooperate with that desire." "How does one do that?" Edmund asked, genuinely perplexed. "By paying attention," Cuthbert said. "By observing how the wax behaves at different temperatures. By noticing the way that different batches blend. By listening to what the material is trying to teach you, rather than insisting that it conform to your preconceived notion of what the finished product should be." Cuthbert moved to the work table and began to prepare fresh wax, working with a slowness that suggested he was thinking deeply about each movement. Edmund and brother Thomas watched as the old master mixed two batches of wax of slightly different colors, heating them to different temperatures, and then began a dipping process that was subtly different from what Edmund had been attempting. Rather than trying to create an abrupt transition between colors, Cuthbert seemed to be creating a gradual blending, allowing the wax itself to determine where the color shifted from one shade to another. The result was a candle of extraordinary beauty, not a forced gradient but a natural transition that seemed to emerge from the very nature of the materials themselves. "Do you see?" Cuthbert said when the candle had cooled sufficiently to examine. "The wax knows how to do this. It has wanted to do this all along. We were simply not listening." Edmund stared at the perfect candle, understanding that he had just witnessed a lesson that transcended the mere technical. Cuthbert was teaching him something about surrender, about the relationship between intention and acceptance, about the way that excellence emerged not from forcing one's will upon the materials, but from cooperating with the essential nature of those materials. "This is perhaps the most important thing I can teach you," Cuthbert said to both Edmund and brother Thomas. "After decades of practice, the technical skill becomes almost automatic, but the deepest mastery comes when you learn to work in harmony with the materials, when you recognize that you and the wax and the fire are all part of a single process, all working together toward excellence." The weeks progressed toward summer, and the bishop's candles gradually neared completion. Edmund, working with Cuthbert's guidance and brother Thomas's increasingly confident assistance, completed candle after candle, each one a small masterpiece of craft and intention. It was clear to everyone that brother Cuthbert's health was gradually declining. The old master moved more slowly with each passing week, and there were days when he could not rise early enough to work in the chandlery with Edmund and Thomas. But on the days when Cuthbert was able to work, his presence transformed the space, and his influence on both Edmund and brother Thomas deepened with each passing interaction. One afternoon in late May, as the monastery was settling into the full warmth of late spring, Cuthbert suggested that Edmund and he walk together through the monastery grounds. It was a slow walk, requiring frequent rests, but Edmund understood that the old master had something he wished to discuss away from the chandlery. They made their way to the herb garden, where the earliest summer plants were beginning to emerge from the earth. Brother Cuthbert settled himself on a stone bench, and Edmund sat beside him. "I will not live many more years," Cuthbert said without preamble. "Perhaps a year or two if God wills it. Certainly not many more than that. I can feel it in my body. The work is almost done." Edmund felt a wave of sadness wash through him at these words, though he had been half expecting them. "I am glad you came," Edmund said. "I am grateful for these weeks we have had." "I came because I needed to know that the work would continue," Cuthbert said. "Not just that it would continue, but that it would continue in fullness, that it would continue to grow and develop and become more refined. And now I know that it will." The old master turned to face Edmund directly. "You have done well, Edmund, more than well. You have taken what I taught you and you have made it your own. and you have found a student who carries within him the potential to become a master even beyond what you have achieved. This gives me great peace." "Brother Thomas will be exceptional," Edmund agreed. "I have little doubt of that." "Yes," Cuthbert said. "And now I must ask you something, Edmund. When Thomas returns to Yorkshire with me, I would like for you to consider coming as well. Not permanently, perhaps, but for a season to help him complete his training, to see the Yorkshire monastery, to understand the work that continues there. Would you consider it?" Edmund felt a surprise ripple through him. He had not anticipated this suggestion. The monastery where he had lived for 30 years was his home. The thought of leaving it, even temporarily, seemed almost impossible. But as he considered the proposal, he began to understand its rightness. The work was not truly Edmund's work or Cuthbert's work or even Brother Thomas's work. The work belonged to the tradition itself, to the continuity of craft and knowledge that extended backward through generations of Chandlers and forward into a future that Edmund would not himself experience. To participate in that continuity more fully, to travel to Yorkshire, to help establish Brother Thomas in his final training, to close the circle that had been opened when Cuthbert had departed 30 years ago. This seemed like a completion that the work itself was calling for. "I will speak to the abbot," Edmund said, "but I believe I will go. I believe it is what the work requires." Brother Cuthbert smiled, and in that smile Edmund saw both gratitude and peace. The satisfaction of a man who had ensured that what he had devoted his life to would continue and would flourish. The decision to travel to Yorkshire with Brother Cuthbert and Brother Thomas settled upon Edmund like a gentle but profound shift in the landscape of his life. The abbot had accepted the proposal with understanding and grace, recognizing that Edmund's departure, even though it would be temporary, served a purpose larger than the immediate needs of the monastery. Another young monk with aptitude for the craft would eventually be trained to continue the chandlery's work in Edmund's absence. The final weeks of spring became a time of preparation and transition. The bishop's candles were completed, all 50 of them, each one a masterpiece of craft and intention. When the messenger arrived from the bishop's residence to collect them, he stood in the chandelier in genuine awe, turning the candles slowly in the afternoon light, observing the extraordinary quality of every detail. "These are the finest candles I have ever seen," the messenger said, and Edmund could hear genuine reverence in his voice. "The bishop will be deeply moved." The messenger departed with the carefully packed candles, and Edmund felt the particular satisfaction that came with the completion of significant work. The candles would burn in the cathedral, would provide light for sacred ceremonies, and would serve purposes that Edmund himself would never witness. And yet the work was complete, was whole, was exactly what it needed to be. Brother Thomas had become noticeably more confident and skilled during the weeks of work with the bishop's candles. Under Cuthbert's patient guidance and Edmund's steady example, the young monk had moved from apprentice to journeyman, capable of creating candles that were approaching the quality of Edmund's own work. There was still refinement to come, still subtleties to learn, but Thomas had crossed an invisible threshold. He was no longer merely learning the craft. He was practicing it with genuine mastery. One evening in early June, as the long daylight of summer began to make the evening offices feel almost premature in their timing, Edmund stood in the chandelier alone. The workspace was quiet, the fire banked low since no work was planned for that day. He looked around at the molds, the work tables, the shelves where finished candles rested, and he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what this space had meant to him. 30 years. 30 years of coming to this room in the pre-dawn darkness. 30 years of the rhythmic work of creating light. 30 years of solitude and prayer combined with the meditation of craft. The chandlery had been not merely a workspace but a kind of spiritual home, a place where Edmund had discovered that the work of his hands could be a form of prayer, that excellence in craft could be a way of serving God, that the creation of light was itself a sacred act. He knew, with the certainty that came from his advanced age and his long observation of the patterns of monastic life, that he would not return to the chandlery in quite the same way after the journey to Yorkshire. Even if he lived many more years, even if he worked many more decades, something would have changed. The chapter of his life devoted to the chandlery of this particular monastery was coming to a close. A new chapter was beginning. This knowledge brought no sadness, only a deep sense of completion and gratitude. The work had been good, the work had been meaningful, and the work would continue through others. The preparations for travel consumed the latter part of June. Brother Cuthbert's health had stabilized somewhat as the warmer weather arrived, and the healing properties of spring turned toward the vitality of summer. The old master was still frail, but his mind remained sharp, and his determination to make the journey was unshakable. Provisions were gathered for the road. Edmund had not traveled more than a day's journey from the monastery in decades, and there was something almost dreamlike about the process of preparing to leave. He gathered his few possessions, the simple robes of a Benedictine monk, the few personal items he had accumulated over 30 years. Everything fits easily into a small bundle. Brother Thomas was vibrating with a combination of excitement and apprehension. The young monk had never traveled more than the initial journey that had brought him to the monastery as a novice. The prospect of a multi-week journey to Yorkshire, of studying under Brother Cuthbert in a different monastery, of living in a new community, all of it seemed to simultaneously terrify and energize the young monk. "Will I ever return here?" Thomas asked Edmund one afternoon as they were making final preparations. "That is not for me to know," Edmund said gently. "Your life will unfold according to God's plan, brother. Perhaps you will return. Perhaps you will remain in Yorkshire and do your life's work there. Perhaps you will travel to some other monastery entirely. The important thing is that you remain open to the unfolding of your vocation, that you do not cling to any particular outcome." But Edmund himself wondered about the same question. Would he return to this monastery? He was old, 73 years, if his memory served him correctly. A long journey at his age was not without risk, and even if he survived the journey and the time in Yorkshire, even if he returned to this place, would he have the strength to continue working in the chandlery as he had worked for 30 years? These questions held no fear for him, only curiosity. Edmund had learned long ago that the future was not his to determine, that his role was simply to do his present work with as much care and intention as he could muster, and to trust that the rest would unfold as it should. The morning of departure came on a day of extraordinary beauty. The summer sun was warm but not yet fierce. The sky was clear, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers and growing things. The entire monastery seemed to come out to bid farewell to the three travelers. The abbot himself walked with Edmund, Cuthbert, and Thomas to the monastery gates. "God go with you," he said, offering his blessing. "May the journey be safe, and may your work in Yorkshire bear much fruit." Beyond the gates lay the road north, stretching away toward Yorkshire and toward whatever awaited them there. The journey was slow by necessity. Brother Cuthbert, though determined and courageous, could not walk for many hours without rest. The three monks proceeded at a pace that seemed almost glacial compared to how Edmund's younger body might have moved decades earlier. But Edmund had come to understand that there was wisdom in slow travel, in the way that moving gradually through the world allowed one to observe it more carefully, to appreciate it more fully. They followed the merchant roads northward, staying in small monasteries and hostels along the way. In each place, Brother Cuthbert was welcomed with respect, recognized as a monk of considerable experience and wisdom. Edmund noticed how the old master's reputation preceded him, how other chandlers and craftspeople sought him out, hopping for advice and guidance. It was clear that Brother Cuthbert's reputation in the larger world of monastic craft was substantial. Edmund had known this intellectually, but seeing it directly, seeing how other monks deferred to Cuthbert's opinion, how they brought their own difficult problems to the old master for counsel, gave Edmund a new appreciation for the man who had trained him. One evening, in a monastery near the border between the southern and northern counties, Edmund found himself speaking with another chandler who had come specifically to meet Brother Cuthbert. "I have heard of your work in Yorkshire," this other chandler said to Edmund. "Brother Cuthbert has written about the candles you create. He calls you a true master of the craft. This is high praise indeed from one as exacting as Brother Cuthbert." Edmund felt warmth spread through his chest at these words. He had never thought of himself in such grand terms. He was simply a monk who had devoted his life to a craft, who had done his work with care and intention. But perhaps, he reflected, that was exactly what made one a master, not the seeking of mastery, but rather the faithful devotion to excellence in one's assigned work. After 3 weeks of steady travel, the monastery in Yorkshire appeared before them like a promised land. It was larger than Edmund's own monastery, built of the same gray stone, but arranged in a slightly different configuration that reflected its more recent construction and more extensive operations. Brother Cuthbert's home monastery welcomed him with genuine joy. The other monks embraced the old master, clearly holding him in deep affection despite his long absence each day. Edmund and Brother Thomas were received with warm hospitality, and they were quickly settled into small cells in the guest quarters. That evening after prime, Cuthbert led Edmund and Brother Thomas to the Yorkshire chandlery. It was a larger, more modern space than the one Edmund had worked in for 30 years, with better windows and more sophisticated equipment. But the fundamental work was the same molds, the same processes, the same patient transformation of beeswax into light. "This is where I have worked since I left your monastery," Cuthbert said, his voice carrying a kind of homecoming emotion. "This is where I have spent the last 30 years creating light for this community." Edmund moved through the space slowly, observing how another master chandler had organized his work, what refinements and variations Cuthbert had developed over the years. He could see how the Yorkshire chandlery represented a continuation of the work Edmund did, but also a distinct evolution, the result of Cuthbert's own 30 years of practice and experimentation. "Now," Cuthbert said, looking at both Edmund and Brother Thomas, "we must decide how to organize the work we will do together. I have trained some younger monks here in the basics of chandlery, but I have never had a student of Brother Thomas's potential. And Edmund, I have much to teach you still, lessons I have learned in the decades since you departed." Edmund felt a thrill of anticipation at the prospect. Even after a lifetime of practice, even after achieving a level of mastery that other craftspeople recognized and honored, there was still more to learn. The work of creating candles, of cooperating with beeswax and fire and intention to produce light, was apparently inexhaustible in its depth. There was always another refinement, another subtlety, another way of understanding the fundamental principles. The rhythm of the Yorkshire monastery was similar to Edmund's own monastery, but with subtle variations that made it feel both familiar and foreign. The offices were at the same time, but the chants were slightly different, carrying regional variations that Edmund found beautiful and strange in equal measure. The chandlery work began the following morning. The three of them, Edmund, Cuthbert, and Brother Thomas, worked together in a kind of sacred collaboration. Cuthbert moved more slowly here in his home monastery, seemed more tired, as though the journey had taken more from him than he had anticipated. But his mind remained sharp, and his hands, though gnarled with age, still remembered the precise movements required for the craft. What emerged over the following weeks was a kind of intensive apprenticeship, unlike anything Edmund had previously experienced. Cuthbert began to teach them the deepest refinements of the craft, techniques that required not just skill, but a kind of spiritual understanding, a way of working that transcended the merely technical. He taught them about the way that candlelight reflected the inner state of the chandler, how a candle made in peace and attention would burn differently than one made in haste or distraction. He taught them about the relationship between the seasons and the quality of the wax, the way that beeswax prepared in different times of year carried different properties. He taught them about listening to the wax, about paying attention to how it wanted to be shaped, about the partnership between the craftsman and the material. And most profoundly, he taught them about the purpose of light. Not light as mere illumination, but light as a spiritual principle, as a manifestation of divine presence, as the physical expression of knowledge and truth and hope. "Every candle we make," Cuthbert said one afternoon as the three of them worked, "is a small prayer. It is our way of saying, 'Let there be light.' And when that candle burns, when it provides illumination for prayer or study or simple comfort in the darkness, we are participating in the fundamental act of creation. We are doing what God does, bringing light into darkness." Brother Thomas listened to these teachings with an intensity of focus that was beautiful to witness. The young monk was being initiated not just into a craft, but into a kind of spiritual practice, and was learning that excellence in work was itself a form of holiness. Edmund found himself receiving the teachings differently than he would have received them 30 years earlier. He was old now, and he knew the contours of his own mortality. He had perhaps 10 or 15 years remaining, if God granted him health and life. These teachings from Brother Cuthbert were not knowledge to be stored up for future use. They were knowledge that Edmund needed immediately, knowledge that would complete his own understanding, knowledge that would allow him to move toward the end of his life with full awareness and peace. As July turned toward August, Edmund became aware that Brother Cuthbert's health was declining more rapidly than he had anticipated. The old master continued to work, continued to teach, but his energy was visibly diminishing. He tired more easily, rested more frequently, and there was a fragility about him that had not been present even a few weeks earlier. It was after Vespers one evening that Cuthbert asked Edmund to walk with him to a quiet corner of the monastery garden. "I do not have much time," the old master said without preamble. "I thought I might have more, but I think my body is ready to return to dust. The journey from my monastery to yours, and then the work here with you and Brother Thomas, it has used up what remained of my strength." Edmund felt sorrow move through him, but underneath the sorrow was a kind of acceptance. Cuthbert was old, was tired, had accomplished what he had set out to accomplish. There was peace in that, even as there was loss. "You have given us so much," Edmund said. "You have taught us not just techniques but philosophy, not just craft but spirituality. Your life's work continues through us." "Yes," Cuthbert said, "and that is why I could depart from your monastery 30 years ago with peace. I knew that what I had taught you would not die with me. And now, seeing Brother Thomas, seeing how deeply he has taken the work into his soul, I know that the knowledge will continue to grow and flourish long after I am gone." The old master took Edmund's hand, and Edmund was struck by how light and fragile Cuthbert's grip had become. "In another few weeks," Cuthbert continued, "I want you to depart. You should return to your own monastery. Your work there is not finished. Brother Thomas will remain with me through the autumn and into early winter. By then, he will have learned all that I can teach him. Then you can send word and he can return to you or go wherever the church requires him. But your place is not here indefinitely. Your place is in the chandlery where you have worked for 30 years. "I do not wish to abandon you," Edmund said. "You are not abandoning me," Cuthbert said gently. "You are trusting me to do what I came to do, to ensure that Brother Thomas receives the fullness of training that he requires. And you are honoring the work itself by returning to the place where you have devoted your life. That is not abandonment. That is faithfulness." The remaining weeks of Edmund's time in Yorkshire took on a bittersweet quality. He continued to work in the chandlery with Brother Cuthbert and Brother Thomas, but he was now consciously observing everything, fixing every detail in his memory, understanding that this time was finite and precious. One afternoon, as August was reaching its conclusion, Edmund found Brother Thomas weeping quietly in the chandlery after Cuthbert had departed for his afternoon rest. "What troubles you, brother?" Edmund asked gently. "I am afraid," Thomas said. "Afraid that Brother Cuthbert will not live to see the autumn. Afraid that I will not receive all the teaching I need from him. Afraid of losing him." Edmund sat with the young monk for a time, understanding the depth of Thomas's emotion. In these weeks in Yorkshire, Brother Thomas had formed a bond with Cuthbert that went far beyond the merely practical. The young monk had encountered something rare, a master craftsman who was also a spiritual guide, who could teach not just the how of a craft but the why, not just technique but meaning. "Brother Cuthbert will give you everything you need," Edmund said finally. "He will compress into the remaining time everything that matters most, and even when he is gone, his teaching will continue through you. Every candle you make after his death will be informed by what you have learned from him. In that way, he will live on indefinitely." Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing this truth. Edmund could see the young monk beginning to understand what he himself had learned over decades, that the work outlasted the individual worker, that excellence in craft was a form of immortality, that what Cuthbert had taught was not dependent on Cuthbert's continued physical presence to continue influencing the world. In early September, Edmund prepared for his departure. The journey back to his own monastery would take 3 weeks, and he had asked one of the Yorkshire monks to travel with him, recognizing that his age made solo travel inadvisable. On his final morning in the chandlery, Edmund stood alone in the space where Cuthbert had worked for 30 years. He looked at the molds, the workstations, the careful organization that reflected a lifetime of practice. He thought about how this room had been where Cuthbert had continued the work that he himself had learned as a young apprentice, how the work had unfolded across the span of 60 years and 2 separate monasteries, how it would now continue through Brother Thomas in ways that would probably exceed both Edmund's and Cuthbert's own achievements. He thought about the bishop's candles, now burning in the cathedral. He thought about the 50 years of candles he had created for his own monastery. He thought about all the light that had been provided by his hands, illuminating prayer, illuminating study, illuminating the simple darkness of monastic life. It seemed like very little when measured against the vastness of time. And yet, Edmund reflected, the small candles of individual lives and individual efforts, when combined with the small candles of countless others devoted to excellence and service, created a kind of luminescence that transcended the individual, that became part of something larger and more enduring than any single person's work. The bell for prime rang across the monastery, and Edmund made his way to the church to join his brothers for the final time in this place. The journey southward began on a morning of extraordinary clarity, as if the earth itself had been newly washed clean. Edmund traveled with Brother Martin, a monk from the Yorkshire monastery, who was returning to visit family in the southern counties, and who had agreed to accompany Edmund back to his home. Brother Martin was a younger man, perhaps 40, still vigorous and capable. Edmund was grateful for the companion's steady presence and practical care. Martin carried most of their provisions, adjusted their pace to accommodate Edmund's aging body, and navigated the roads with an ease that came from having traveled them several times before. The first days of travel were the most difficult. Edmund's body, accustomed to the familiar rhythms of his own monastery, protested the constant motion, the sleeping in unfamiliar beds, the exposure to weather and the elements. His knees ached more intensely than they had in years. His back complained with every mile. But he persisted, understanding that the journey itself was a kind of final pilgrimage, a necessary transition between the world he had inhabited in Yorkshire and the world that awaited him back at his home monastery. As they traveled, Edmund found his mind returning again and again to the weeks he had spent with Brother Cuthbert. The old master had seemed to deteriorate visibly in those final days, as though the act of transmitting his knowledge had used up the last reserves of his vitality. On Edmund's final evening in Yorkshire, Cuthbert had embraced him with a tenderness that carried in it a kind of farewell, not the temporary goodbye of someone who expected to see a friend again, but the deeper farewell of one preparing for a longer parting. "Thank you," Cuthbert had said simply, "for being the student I hoped you would be, for becoming the master that the work required." Edmund had wanted to respond, had wanted to say something that would capture the depth of his gratitude and his love for the old master. But words had seemed inadequate, and instead he had simply held Cuthbert, feeling the fragile frame of the elderly monk in his arms, and had remained silent. Now, traveling southward, Edmund found himself wondering if he would ever see Cuthbert alive again. The old master's health had been declining so visibly, the exhaustion so profound. Edmund thought about how he was 73 years old himself, how the years remaining to him were necessarily finite, how this journey might be among the final significant undertakings of his life. Rather than bringing anxiety, these thoughts brought a kind of peaceful clarity. Edmund had lived a good life. He had done work that was meaningful. He had trained a student who carried within him great potential. If death came soon, it would come to a man who had completed his primary work, who had fulfilled his vocation, who could depart this life without significant regret. The journey proceeded through late September and into early October. The roads carried Edmund and Brother Martin through increasingly familiar territory as they moved south. The autumn had begun its transformation of the landscape, leaves turning from green to gold and crimson, the days growing shorter, the quality of light becoming slanted and golden. It was on the road one afternoon, as they were passing through a small village, that they encountered a traveling merchant carrying letters and news from the north. Brother Martin spoke with the merchant, exchanging what information they had for news of the roads ahead. As the merchant was departing, he paused. "There is news from Yorkshire," he said. "A monk died there 2 weeks ago, an old man, a master of some craft. Brother Cuthbert, I think the name was. The monastery held a memorial service for him. He was greatly honored in the community." Edmund felt the news settle into him like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples that would radiate outward for some time. He had half expected this news, and had carried a kind of anticipatory grief since his departure from Yorkshire. But the reality of it, the confirmation that Cuthbert had passed from this life, struck him with a force that he had not quite anticipated. Brother Martin, seeing Edmund's reaction, placed a gentle hand on the older monk's shoulder. "I am sorry, brother. Was he a friend?" "He was my teacher," Edmund said quietly. "More than a teacher. He was the man who taught me how to transform my hands' work into prayer, how to find holiness in craft. He was the best man I have known." They continued their journey in silence, but Edmund's grief gradually transformed into something more complex. Gratitude mixed with sorrow, acceptance mingled with loss. Cuthbert had completed his work. The old master had ensured that his knowledge was passed forward through Edmund and through Brother Thomas. Cuthbert had done what he came to do, and then had released his hold on life. There was something peaceful in that, Edmund reflected. The old chandler had not clung to life beyond his usefulness. He had simply laid down his burden when the burden had been placed into other hands. 3 weeks after his departure from Yorkshire, Edmund came within sight of his home monastery. He had traveled this same road in reverse only a few months earlier, but the world had transformed in that time. The spring greens had become autumn golds. The growth that had been all around him then had now begun its retreat into dormancy. The monastery itself seemed to rise from the landscape exactly as he remembered it, unchanged and eternal, a place that existed somewhat outside of ordinary time. The monks came out to greet him as he approached, not the entire community, but a significant number of them, including the abbot and several of the older monks with whom Edmund had worked for decades. There was genuine joy in their welcome, but Edmund also sensed an undercurrent of concern. They had not expected him to be gone for so long. They had not known whether he would return at all. "Brother Edmund," the abbot said, embracing him warmly. "Welcome home. We have worried for you and wondered how you fared in Yorkshire." "I have been well," Edmund said. "The journey was difficult, and Brother Cuthbert has recently passed into God's peace. But the work was significant, and I have learned much." The abbot nodded with understanding. "Come. You must be exhausted. Rest first, and then we will speak of your time away." The chandlery had been maintained in Edmund's absence, but it had not been actively used. A younger monk had been assigned to create the basic candles needed for the monastery's daily use, but the work had been modest, functional. The space itself seemed to be waiting for Edmund's return, seeming somehow less alive than he remembered it. Edmund entered the chandlery as though entering a sacred space. Everything was as he had left it, the molds arranged on their shelves, the work tables clean and ready, the fire laid but not lit. He stood for a long moment, simply observing, reacquainting himself with the physical space that had been his second home for 30 years. Slowly, he began the process of preparing to work again. He rekindled the fire, letting the flames gradually grow from embers to a steady glow. He examined the molds, checking them for any damage or deterioration. He verified that the stored beeswax was in good condition, that nothing had spoiled during his absence. The work of preparation took several hours, and by the time Edmund had finished, it was well past the time for vespers. He heard the bell calling the monks to evening prayer, but he remained in the chandlery, simply sitting before the fire, feeling the warmth and watching the flames dance. Brother Thomas's absence was acute at this moment. Edmund had grown accustomed, over the months of work together, to the young monk's presence, to his questions and his careful observations and his gradual mastery. The chandlery seemed diminished without him, even though Edmund had worked alone in this space for 29 years before Thomas ever arrived. But Thomas would return, Edmund reminded himself. The young monk was completing his training with Brother Cuthbert in Yorkshire. When that training was complete, Thomas would come back to this monastery, would take over the day-to-day work of creating candles, and would carry forward what both Edmund and Cuthbert had taught him. Edmund's own role in the chandlery was shifting. He could feel it, could sense that the work he was called to do now was different from the work of the previous decades. The intensive, daily production of candles would eventually pass to Brother Thomas. Edmund's remaining years in the chandlery would likely be devoted to refinement, to advanced teaching, to the slow distillation of knowledge that had accumulated across a lifetime. The following morning, Edmund rose before dawn as he always had, but for the first time in months, he felt the full weight of his 73 years. The journey from Yorkshire had taken a toll that was now becoming apparent. His joints were stiff, his muscles were sore, and there was a fatigue in his bones that suggested it would take considerable time for his body to fully recover from the extended travel. He moved slowly through his morning preparations, and then made his way to the chandelier. The fire from the previous evening had burned down to embers, and he carefully rekindled it, adding fresh wood and allowing the flames to grow. By the time the bell for matins rang, Edmund was ready to begin work. The first candles he made upon his return were modest ones, simple candles for the monk's personal use, straightforward work that required skill but not the most intense concentration. As his hands remembered the familiar motions, as his body began to readjust to the rhythms of the work, Edmund felt a profound sense of homecoming. This was what he was meant to do. This was his vocation, his calling, his purpose. Not the travel to Yorkshire, not even the time with Brother Cuthbert, though all of that had been valuable and meaningful. His real work was here in this room, creating light for his community day after day, year after year, decade after decade. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of work. Dip, wait, dip. Layer upon layer, the candles gradually taking form. By midday, Edmund had completed 3 batches of simple candles, enough to sustain the monastery's basic needs for the coming weeks. It was after the midday meal that Brother Cormac approached him. Brother Cormac was one of the oldest monks in the community, nearly as old as Edmund himself, and he had been a friend for many years. "Brother Edmund," Cormac said, "we are glad to have you back. The community has missed you, but I came to tell you something. Brother Oswin has asked if he might apprentice with you in the chandlery. He has felt called to the work, and he seems to have genuine aptitude. The abbot is willing to permit it if you are agreeable." Edmund felt something shift in his chest, a kind of recognition that the cycle was continuing, that even as Brother Thomas had come to learn from him, so now would another young monk begin the same journey of discovery. "Yes," Edmund said without hesitation, "I am agreeable. Send Brother Oswin to me tomorrow morning and we will begin." Over the following weeks, Edmund found himself settling into a new rhythm in the chandlery. Brother Oswin was a quiet, serious young monk of perhaps 25 years, with capable hands and a genuine humility before the work. He was not quite as naturally gifted as Brother Thomas had been, but he possessed something equally valuable, a kind of steady persistence, a willingness to work carefully, a respect for excellence that went beyond mere technical skill. Edmund taught Oswin as he had taught Thomas, beginning with observation, gradually allowing the young monk to participate more actively in the work. But Edmund's teaching had evolved as well. The weeks in Yorkshire, the intense study with Brother Cuthbert, had given Edmund new language for what he had always known, new ways of explaining the philosophy behind the technique. One afternoon, as Edmund was teaching Oswin how to test the temperature of wax using only the sensitivity of the fingertip, the older monk found himself speaking words that he now understood had come originally from Brother Cuthbert. "The wax knows what it wishes to become," Edmund said. "Your work is not to force the wax to comply with your will. Your work is to listen to what the wax is trying to teach you, and then to cooperate with that intention. When you work in harmony with the material rather than against it, excellence emerges naturally." Brother Oswin nodded carefully, absorbing this teaching, and Edmund could see the young monk beginning to understand that the work was not mechanical but relational, a kind of dance between the craftsman and the material. In early November, a letter arrived from the Yorkshire monastery. It was addressed to Edmund and bore the seal of the abbot there. With some trepidation, Edmund broke the seal and read, "So, Brother Edmund, it is with great sorrow that I write to inform you of the passing of Brother Cuthbert into God's peace. The old master departed this life peacefully, 2 weeks after your own departure. He spent his final days in prayer and contemplation, and he spoke frequently of you and of Brother Thomas. Before his death, Brother Cuthbert asked that I write to you with a final message. He said, 'Tell Edmund that the work is complete. Tell him that he has nothing left to prove, nothing left to accomplish. His remaining years are a gift to be lived in gratitude and peace, creating light not because it is demanded but because it brings joy.' Brother Cuthbert also requested that Brother Thomas remain here through the winter. The young monk is progressing extraordinarily well, and Cuthbert felt, as do I, that one more season of intensive study would be valuable. Brother Thomas will depart for your monastery in the spring. May God bless you and keep you, Brother Edmund. May the light you create continue to illuminate the darkness for many years yet to come. In Christ, Abbot Richard of Yorkshire." Edmund read the letter twice, holding Cuthbert's final words close to his heart. The old master's message came to him like a benediction, like permission to let go of the intensity of striving that had characterized so much of his life. The work was complete. The knowledge had been passed forward. His role now was simply to live his remaining years in gratitude, creating light not out of duty but out of love. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small wooden box where he kept his most precious possessions. Winter settled over the monastery, and with it came a particular quality of stillness that Edmund had always loved. The days were short, the nights long, the world seemed to contract and focus inward. In the chandlery, the work continued with steady rhythm, creating candles for the monastery's use, maintaining the light that allowed the community to continue its life of prayer and work through the dark months. Brother Oswin was improving steadily. By late November, the young monk was capable of creating acceptable candles with minimal supervision. By December, Oswin's work was becoming quite skilled, showing the marks of genuine promise. One evening, as Edmund and Oswin were finishing the day's work, the younger monk asked a question that Edmund had been expecting. "Brother Edmund, when will I be ready to work more independently? When will I no longer need your constant supervision?" Edmund considered the question carefully. "You are nearly ready now," he said finally. "But there is still much to learn, not just technique but understanding. I think that in the spring, when Brother Thomas returns from Yorkshire, the two of you can work together. Brother Thomas will have completed his advanced training with Brother Cuthbert, and you will be ready to develop your own independent mastery. The two of you will push each other toward excellence in ways that I alone could not." Brother Oswin's face showed both gratitude and anticipation. The young monk was beginning to understand that learning the craft was not a process with a clear ending point, but rather an eternal unfolding, a constant deepening of understanding and capability. As December progressed toward Christmas, Edmund found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey his life had taken. 73 years was a long span. He had lived through the reigns of 3 kings, had seen technologies and understandings change, had witnessed the rise and fall of abbots and brothers. And yet the fundamental work had remained constant: the transformation of beeswax into light, the creation of candles to illuminate the darkness. On the feast of St. Lucy, the monastery celebrated with particular joy, honoring the Saint of Light with special candles that Edmund and Oswin had prepared with extraordinary care. The great church was filled with beeswax candles, their flames burning steadily, their light creating a kind of visible prayer that filled the sacred space. Edmund stood at the back of the church, observing the flames, and felt a profound sense of completion. This was what his life had been for: to create light so that others could see more clearly, so that prayer could be more beautiful, so that the darkness could be illuminated. The bell for Compline would ring soon, and with it would come the final prayers of the day. Edmund remained in the church for a moment longer, simply watching the flames, feeling the warmth and the light radiating outward into the stone space, filling it with the work of his hands. He thought of Brother Cuthbert, now departed into God's peace. He thought of Brother Thomas, continuing his training in Yorkshire. He thought of Brother Oswin, just beginning his long journey into mastery. He thought of all the monks over centuries who had devoted themselves to the creation of light, who had understood that in creating candles, they were participating in the fundamental work of bringing light into darkness. The work would continue long after he was gone. The work would outlast them all. And in that continuation, in that persistence of excellence across generations, Edmund found the deepest peace. The winter deepened around the monastery, bringing with it snow that fell gently and persistently, covering the stone buildings in soft white that seemed to muffle the world into quietness. Edmund moved through the cold days with the ease of long practice, his body adjusted to the climate, his work proceeding with the same steady rhythm it had maintained for 30 years. Brother Oswin had become increasingly independent in his work, requiring Edmund's guidance only for the most delicate tasks or the most challenging technical refinements. It was a particular joy to watch the young monk progress, to observe as Oswin's hands gradually learned what his mind struggled to fully comprehend, to see the moment-by-moment transformation of an uncertain novice into a confident journeyman. One afternoon in late December, as Edmund and Oswin were working side by side creating candles for the monastery's Christmas observances, Edmund made an unexpected decision. "Brother Oswin," he said, pausing in his work, "I believe you are ready to work independently for extended periods. Beginning after Christmas, I will reduce my time in the candy shop. I will be here to guide you, to answer questions, to refine your technique. But the primary work, the daily creation of candles for the monastery, will fall to you." Brother Oswin's hand stilled mid-motion. "Brother Edmund, I am not certain I am ready. There is still so much I do not fully understand." "You will never feel entirely ready," Edmund said gently. "That is one of the truths of the craft. The only way to become truly ready is to do the work, to face challenges as they arise, to learn through experience rather than through observation alone. You have learned all that I can teach you from watching. Now you must learn through doing." Edmund set down his wick and turned to face the young monk fully. "In the spring, Brother Thomas will return from Yorkshire. He will have completed advanced training that I myself never received, refinements that Brother Cuthbert taught him. At that point, you and Thomas can work together, can challenge each other, and can help each other grow even further. But for now, in these winter months, you must learn to carry the work on your own shoulders." Brother Oswin looked frightened, but Edmund could also see determination in the young monk's expression. "I will do my best, Brother Edmund. I will not disappoint you." "You will make mistakes," Edmund said, and there was a gentle certainty in his voice. "You will create candles that do not meet the standard. You will face difficulties that you have not encountered before. This is not failure. This is learning. The wax accepts our mistakes and teaches us through them." After Christmas, Edmund fulfilled his intention. He came to the chandlery each morning and spent the early hours supervising Oswin's work, offering guidance and correction. But as the day progressed and the morning work was complete, Edmund increasingly withdrew, spending his afternoons in other pursuits. He began to attend more of the daytime offices than he had in years. He spent time in the monastery library, reading texts on scripture and the lives of saints. He walked the cloisters when the weather permitted, observing the life of the community with the kind of attention that came from gradually stepping back from intensive work. This shift brought unexpected changes. Edmund discovered that he was tired in ways he had not been tired before, not the satisfying tiredness of a day spent in meaningful work, but a deeper exhaustion that seemed to come from the very bones themselves. His knees ached more persistently. His hands, which had always been his primary tool, began to show more visible signs of age, the joints swelling slightly, the movements becoming gradually less fluid. One evening, after Compline, The abbot asked to speak with Edmund privately. "Brother Edmund," the abbot said, his voice carrying concern, "I have observed that you seem to be withdrawing from the chandlery. I want to understand your intention. Are you unwell? Is there some matter that troubles you?" Edmund considered how to respond truthfully without causing unnecessary worry. "I am not unwell, abbot, or perhaps I am, but it is the weariness of age rather than any acute illness. I am 73 years old. I have worked in the chandlery for 30 years with great intensity. I believe my body is telling me that it is time to gradually release that intensity, to allow Brother Oswin to carry more of the work, to prepare myself for whatever comes next." The abbot nodded with understanding. "You are wise, Brother Edmund, but I want you to know that your value to this community does not rest solely on the work of your hands. You are a master of your craft, and your wisdom is valuable beyond the chandlery. The community honors you, and we wish to honor you well in your remaining years." "Thank you, Abbot," Edmund said. "I am grateful, but I think my most important work now is to ensure that Brother Oswin and Brother Thomas, when he returns, are ready to carry forward what has been built. That is service, I believe, to step back gracefully and allow the next generation to take up the work." January turned toward February, and with it came the particular cold of deep winter. Edmund's daily routine had shifted significantly. He still spent time in the chandlery, but often in an observational capacity rather than as the primary worker. He watched Oswin, offered occasional guidance, and gradually began to document some of what he knew: simple written instructions about techniques, notes about the properties of different beeswax sources, observations about how temperature and humidity affected the work. Brother Oswin was developing his own style now, his own way of moving through the craft. While his technique remained influenced by Edmund's teaching, the young monk was beginning to innovate, to make small adjustments that reflected his own understanding and creativity. Edmund found this gratifying. The sign that a student had truly learned was not that they merely imitated the master, but that they began to develop their own approach within the framework they had been taught. It was late in February, as the first subtle signs of approaching spring began to appear, that a messenger arrived from Yorkshire with a letter for Edmund. The letter was from Brother Thomas. "So, Brother Edmund, I write to you from Yorkshire, where I have completed my training under Brother Cuthbert. Though Brother Cuthbert himself has departed this life into God's peace, his spirit remains very much present in this monastery, and his teachings continue to guide my work. These months in Yorkshire have been transformative. Brother Cuthbert taught me refinements and understandings that I could not have learned anywhere else. But more than that, he taught me about the deeper purpose of the craft, the way that creating candles is an act of participation in God's work of bringing light into darkness. I am preparing to return to our monastery in the spring. The abbot here has given me blessing to depart, and Brother Cuthbert, before his passing, gave me his own personal collection of molds, carved by his own hands over many decades. These I will bring back with me so that the tradition of craftsmanship will continue. I am eager to see you again, Brother Edmund. I am eager to see the chandelier where I learned my first lessons. And I am eager to meet Brother Oswin, whom I trust will be further along in his training by the time of my arrival. I will depart Yorkshire in early March and should arrive at our monastery by late April or early May, depending on the state of the roads. With great respect and affection, Brother Thomas. Edmund read the letter several times, and each reading brought him renewed joy. Brother Thomas was returning. The young monk would arrive with advanced training and with Cuthbert's personal molds. The chandlery would soon have 2 skilled workers, each bringing their own understanding and capability. The knowledge that Thomas would soon return seemed to invigorate the entire monastery. Word spread quickly among the brothers that one of their own was coming home, bringing with him both advanced training and artifacts from their sister monastery in Yorkshire. Edmund shared the news with Brother Oswin, and the younger monk received it with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. "Brother Thomas will be a master chandler?" Oswin asked. "Nearly so," Edmund said. "He has received training from Brother Cuthbert that exceeded even what I have been able to teach you. But master or not, what matters is that you will be able to work together, to learn from each other, to challenge each other toward greater excellence." March arrived with its characteristic mixture of lingering winter and emerging spring. The snow began to melt, the days grew noticeably longer, and there was a kind of restlessness in the air as nature prepared for renewal. Edmund's health had stabilized somewhat. He was not as energetic as he had been in the autumn, but neither did he seem to be in obvious decline. His body had adjusted to a slower pace, and he had found a kind of acceptance with aging that brought its own peace. His hands still functioned reasonably well, though with less speed and less precision than in his younger years. One afternoon in mid-March, Edmund found himself alone in the chandelier. Brother Oswin had been given permission to assist in the monastery's spring cleaning, and the workshop was unusually quiet. Edmund moved slowly through the space, observing everything with the kind of attention that came from perhaps recognizing that these quiet moments in this room were becoming increasingly precious. He stood at the work table where he had spent so many thousands of hours, and he allowed himself to remember. He remembered the morning he had arrived at this monastery, young and uncertain, assigned to work in the chandlery with Brother Cuthbert. He remembered the early struggles, the mistakes, the moments of doubt about whether he had the aptitude for the craft. He remembered the years of increasing mastery, the gradual recognition that excellence was possible, the deep satisfaction that came from work done well. He remembered Brother Cuthbert's departure, the fear of inadequacy that had initially accompanied Edmund's assumption of full responsibility. He remembered the slow evolution from fear to confidence, from competence to mastery. And he remembered, most recently, the arrival of Brother Thomas, the process of training a new generation, the extraordinary weeks in Yorkshire with his old master, the chance to receive teachings that had refined and deepened his own understanding even at an advanced age. All of this had happened in this room. All of this had unfolded against the backdrop of the steady work of creating light. Edmund lit the fire, even though it was not necessary for any current work. He simply wanted to watch the flames, to feel the familiar warmth, to sit for a moment in the space that had been his second home for so long. As March progressed toward April, the entire monastery began to prepare for Brother Thomas's return. The guest house was cleaned and made ready. The abbot composed a letter of welcome. Some of the younger monks speculated excitedly about the Yorkshire molds that Thomas was bringing, about what advanced techniques the young monk might teach them. Edmund found himself in a state of quiet anticipation. He had trained Brother Thomas with care and intention, and had done his best to prepare the young monk for greater learning. Now Thomas was returning, having completed that greater learning. It was a perfect completion of a cycle, the student going away to gain advanced knowledge, then returning to bring that knowledge back to the community. One evening after Compline, Edmund walked slowly through the cloister, observing the monastery in the darkness. The spring night was cool but not cold, and the first faint stars were visible in the sky. Somewhere in the darkness, perhaps only a few days' journey away, Brother Thomas was making his way back toward home, carrying with him the knowledge of Brother Cuthbert, carrying the molds that the old master had carved by his own hands. Edmund thought about the great chain of knowledge that extended through generations of chandlers, through centuries even, each one receiving from those who had come before and passing forward to those who would come after. He thought about how Brother Cuthbert had trained him, how he had trained Brother Thomas, how Brother Thomas would eventually train others, and those students would train still others, the work continuing and evolving and deepening across generations. In that moment, standing alone in the cool spring darkness, Edmund felt a profound sense of peace. His work was not finished. There was still important work to do, still refinements to make, still knowledge to share. But his primary work, the work of ensuring that the craft continued in its fullness, that the knowledge was passed forward faithfully and with evolution, that work was essentially complete. Everything that came after this moment would be a kind of gift, additional time to work in a craft he loved, additional opportunity to create light. But the essential task had been accomplished. The chain of knowledge was secure. The future was provided for. The morning of Brother Thomas's anticipated arrival dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that seemed to contain the entire promise of renewal. Edmund rose before dawn as he always did, but instead of proceeding directly to the chandlery, he made his way to the gate of the monastery, where several other monks had gathered to watch the road. The abbot was there, and several of the elder brothers. There was a palpable excitement in the air, the anticipation of reunion, the curiosity about what Brother Thomas would bring back from Yorkshire, the recognition that the return of one of their own was an occasion worth marking. Edmund stood quietly at the back of the group, observing. His role in Thomas's story was shifting. He was no longer the primary teacher, but rather one of many who had invested in the young monk's formation. This shifting felt right to Edmund, felt like a natural progression of things. It was mid-morning when the figure appeared on the road, a monk traveling with two companions, the monk in the center carrying a pack that seemed to contain items of significance. As the travelers drew closer, Edmund recognized Brother Thomas immediately, though the young monk had changed noticeably in the months of his absence. Thomas seemed taller somehow, or perhaps simply more grounded, moving with a confidence that had not been present before. Brother Thomas was embraced by the abbot first, then by the other monks. When his eyes found Edmund in the crowd, the young monk's face lit with a joy so genuine and profound that Edmund felt tears prick his eyes. "Brother Edmund," Thomas said, approaching and bowing respectfully before extending his arms in an embrace that Edmund accepted gladly. "I have thought of you often during my time in Yorkshire. Brother Cuthbert spoke of you frequently, always with great respect and affection." "Welcome home, Brother Thomas," Edmund said, holding the young monk at arm's length to observe him more fully. "You have grown, not in body but in presence. The training in Yorkshire has marked you." "It has been extraordinary," Thomas said. "Brother Cuthbert taught me things I could not have imagined possible, and he sent you a gift before his passing." Thomas gestured to one of his traveling companions, who carefully withdrew from the pack several items wrapped in protective cloth. As the wrappings were removed, beautiful wooden molds were revealed, extraordinary examples of carving craftsmanship, each one bearing the mark of a master's hand. "These were Brother Cuthbert's personal molds," Thomas explained. "He carved them himself over many years. He wished for them to come to our monastery to be used in the chandlery here. He said that they represented 3 generations of knowledge, the chandlers who taught him, the refinements he himself had made, and the future masters who would use them to create even greater excellence." Edmund moved forward to examine the molds closely. Even without handling them, he could see the extraordinary quality of the carving, the depth of understanding that had gone into creating each one. These were not merely functional objects but works of art, each one representing countless hours of careful consideration and refinement. "These are precious beyond measure," Edmund said quietly. "Brother Cuthbert honored us with this gift." After the initial greetings were complete and Brother Thomas had been settled in his cell, Edmund invited the young monk to the chandlery. Thomas had not yet been inside the space, and Edmund wanted to see the room through his student's eyes, to understand how Thomas would perceive the workspace that had been Edmund's domain for 30 years. Brother Oswin was working when they arrived, carefully dipping a word with the precision that he had learned over months of practice. The young monk looked up, startled to see Edmund and another brother entering. "Brother Oswin," Edmund said, "this is Brother Thomas, who has returned from his advanced training in Yorkshire. Brother Thomas, this is Brother Oswin, who has been learning the craft in your absence." The 2 young monks regarded each other with the kind of assessing gaze that suggested they were beginning to understand each other's capability and potential. Edmund could see immediately that they would either become rivals or collaborators, and he suspected that, with proper guidance, they would choose collaboration. Brother Thomas moved slowly through the chandlery, observing everything with an intensity of attention that reminded Edmund of how Thomas had been when first learning the craft. But this was a different kind of attention now, not the uncertainty of a novice trying to understand, but the careful assessment of one trained craftsman observing another's workspace. "It is beautiful," Thomas said finally. "The organization is excellent. Brother Oswin, I can see that you have been learning well." Brother Oswin looked both pleased and slightly awed at the praise from someone who carried the authority of having studied under the legendary Brother Cuthbert. Edmund gestured toward the new molds that one of the monks had brought to the chandelier. "These came from Brother Cuthbert," Edmund explained. "They are masterworks. I think perhaps you should begin by simply observing them, understanding the philosophy behind their creation. Brother Oswin and I can continue with the regular work while you reacquaint yourself with the rhythms of the chandlery." Thomas nodded, and Edmund could see the young monk understanding the wisdom of this approach. There was no rush. The knowledge would unfold gradually, as all true knowledge did. Over the following weeks, the chandlery transformed. Where there had been Edmund and Brother Oswin, now there were three. Edmund moving toward an increasingly advisory role, Oswin continuing his steady development, and Thomas returning with advanced knowledge that he brought to every task. The dynamic that emerged was remarkable. Rather than becoming jealous or competitive, brothers Oswin and Thomas developed a kind of complementary relationship. Oswin had learned Edmund's foundational approach with meticulous care. Thomas had learned Cuthbert's advanced refinements. Together, they began to synthesize approaches, to experiment with combinations of techniques, to explore possibilities that neither of them would have discovered alone. Edmund found himself stepping further back, spending more time observing than doing. He would make suggestions occasionally, would correct technique when necessary, but increasingly he found himself in the role of elder statesman rather than active worker. One afternoon in late May, as the spring had given way fully to early summer, Edmund stood at the entrance to the chandlery, watching the two younger monks work. They were using one of Cuthbert's molds, attempting a technique that Thomas had learned in Yorkshire, but that was new to Edmund and Oswin. The mold created a subtle spiral pattern in the wax as the candles were dipped, resulting in finished candles of extraordinary visual beauty. "Brother Edmund," Brother Thomas called over, noticing his mentor's observation, "come and look at what Brother Oswin has accomplished. His execution of this technique is nearly perfect on the first attempt." Edmund moved closer, and indeed, the candle that Oswin had just withdrawn from the mold showed the spiral pattern with remarkable clarity and precision. The young monk had absorbed the instruction and had implemented it with skill and care. "Excellent work, Brother Oswin," Edmund said warmly. "You have a gift for this craft. Brother Cuthbert would have recognized that immediately." As June progressed, Edmund began to notice changes in his own body that he could not entirely ignore. The fatigue that had been present since his return from Yorkshire seemed to be gradually deepening. His hands, when he worked, tired more quickly. There was an ache in his chest sometimes, nothing alarming but present nonetheless. Edmund did not speak of these changes to anyone. He knew his own body, knew that he was aging, and he accepted the gradual diminishment that came with advancing years. He was 73. He had lived a full life and had accomplished his primary work. Whatever time remained was a gift. But there was one thing he wished to do before whatever changes lay ahead became too pronounced. He wished to work one more significant commission with brothers Thomas and Oswin, to create something that represented the synthesis of all three of their different trainings, all three of their different approaches. He spoke to the abbot about it. "Abbot Thomas," Edmund said, "I wonder if it might be possible to commission a special set of candles, perhaps 50 or 100, as a memorial to Brother Cuthbert. These would be extraordinary candles, created with the full knowledge that Brothers Thomas and Oswin and I possess. They would represent a kind of completion of the Master's life work, candles that bear the mark of his influence even though they are made after his passing." The abbot considered this proposal thoughtfully. "That is a beautiful idea, Brother Edmund. Yes, I think this is fitting. I will write to the monastery in Yorkshire and propose that they receive these candles as a memorial to Brother Cuthbert. I am certain they will be deeply moved." The creation of Cuthbert's memorial candles began in July, at the height of summer when the weather was warm and stable, ideal for the most precise work. Edmund, Thomas, and Oswin worked together in a way that was entirely new for them, not as teacher and students, but as three craftsmen of different generations and training, each contributing their own particular expertise and understanding. They began by selecting the finest beeswax, setting aside only the most perfect stock. They prepared special molds, new ones that Edmund and Thomas designed together, incorporating elements of both Edmund's foundational approach and Thomas's advanced techniques. The work proceeded slowly, deliberately. These candles were not made for practical use but as artistic statements, as tributes to the craft itself and to the man who had so deeply understood it. Each one was created with a kind of reverence, a recognition that the work was sacred in the deepest sense. Brother Oswin found himself elevated in this process. Working alongside Brother Edmund and Brother Thomas, creating candles of extraordinary quality, Oswin began to sense that he was approaching mastery himself. The young monk moved with increasing confidence, his hands performing movements that were becoming instinctive, his understanding deepening with each candle completed. It was during one of these working sessions that Edmund felt a sudden tightness in his chest that was slightly more pronounced than the aches he had been experiencing. He paused in his work, waiting for the sensation to pass. "Brother Edmund, are you well?" Brother Thomas asked immediately, noticing his mentor's hesitation. "Yes," Edmund said, and it was true, he was well. The sensation passed and he returned to his work. "I am simply tired, an old man's weariness, nothing of concern." But Thomas was watching him more carefully after that, Edmund noted. The young monk's attention was divided now between the work and Edmund himself, monitoring the older monk's condition. As the summer progressed toward its height, the memorial candles gradually neared completion. 50 had been finished, all of them of extraordinary quality. Edmund, Thomas, and Oswin continued their work, creating more, pushing themselves and each other toward ever greater refinement. It was early August when Edmund realized something essential. The work was complete, not in the sense that no more candles could be made. There was always more work to do, always another refinement possible. But the work that Edmund himself had been called to do was complete. He had trained 2 remarkable students. He had received the transmission of knowledge from Brother Cuthbert. He had created candles of genuine excellence. He had ensured that the craft would continue and flourish. The essential tasks had been accomplished. One evening, after the three of them had finished their day's work, Edmund called brothers Thomas and Oswin to sit with him in the cooling twilight of the chandlery. "I have something I wish to say to you both," Edmund began. "I am an old man. I am 73 years old. I have lived a life devoted to this craft, and I have been blessed beyond measure. But I am beginning to sense that my time of intensive work is drawing toward its close." Brother Oswin looked alarmed, but Edmund raised a gentle hand. "I am not ill as far as I know. I am simply old. And I want to ensure that you both understand something essential. The craft is now in your hands. Brother Thomas, you carry the knowledge of Brother Cuthbert and of our training together. Brother Oswin, you carry the foundational knowledge and your own unique understanding. Together, you are capable of creating candles of extraordinary excellence. Together, you can take this craft to heights that perhaps none of us has reached." Edmund paused, looking at each young monk in turn. "My greatest joy is knowing that when I am gone, the work will continue. Not merely continue, but flourish. You two are the future of this craft, and I trust you completely." Brother Thomas reached out and took Edmund's weathered hand. "Brother Edmund, you must remain with us. Your wisdom is invaluable. Your presence brings to the work something that no one else can provide." "My wisdom will be present in every candle you make," Edmund said gently. "I am not abandoning the work. I am simply recognizing that the time for my active mastery is giving way to the time of my presence and counsel. I will be here as long as God allows, but I will be here more as an observer and guide than as a primary worker. This is fitting. This is right." In the weeks that followed, Edmund's role in the chandlery continued to shift. He came to the workspace each morning, sat near the fire, and observed brothers Thomas and Oswin at their work. He offered occasional guidance, answered questions when asked, but spent much of his time simply watching, simply being present. The two young monks worked beautifully together. Their different training complemented each other perfectly. Where Thomas brought advanced technique and philosophical sophistication, Oswin brought meticulous attention to foundational excellence. Together, they created candles that bore the mark of the entire tradition of which they were a part: the knowledge of Brother Cuthbert, the decades of Edmund's own practice, and their own emerging mastery. One afternoon in late August, as the summer was beginning its transition toward autumn, Edmund sat with Brother Thomas in the chandlery during a quiet moment between work sessions. "Brother Edmund," Thomas said, "I have been thinking about what you said regarding the continuation of the craft. I believe that Brother Oswin and I should begin to teach others. There are young monks in the community who show aptitude. I think it is time to ensure that the knowledge spreads, that we have more than 2 skilled chandlers prepared to carry the work forward." Edmund smiled. This was exactly right. This was the next evolution, the natural progression that would ensure the craft's continuation, even should both Thomas and Oswin eventually depart the monastery or pass from this life. "Yes," Edmund said, "that is precisely what should happen. The knowledge should not rest with only 2 people. It should be distributed, should be shared, should be growing and multiplying. You understand the deepest purpose of the craft, Brother Thomas. It is not to create personal mastery, but to ensure that the work itself continues and flourishes. As August turned into September, Edmund found himself increasingly content simply to be present, to observe the life of the community unfolding around him. His role had become that of elder, keeper of memory, witness to the continuity of the work across generations. The memorial candles to Brother Cuthbert had been completed, over 70 of them, each one a masterpiece. A messenger was being prepared to carry them to Yorkshire, to the monastery where Cuthbert had spent his final years, where they would serve as a permanent memorial to the old master's life and influence. Edmund had decided that he would write a final letter to accompany the candles, a letter from him to the Yorkshire monks, explaining what these candles represented and what Brother Cuthbert had meant not just to his own monastery, but to the entire tradition of chandlery. One evening after Compline, Edmund sat in the monastery's scriptorium with Brother Aelred, one of the monks skilled in calligraphy, and dictated the letter. To the brothers of the Yorkshire monastery, Edmund began, I write to you as one who learned from Brother Cuthbert many decades ago, who received from him the foundational knowledge of the chandler's craft. Since that time, I have devoted my life to continuing the work that he began, to passing the knowledge forward to new generations, to ensuring that what Brother Cuthbert understood continues to flourish. The candles that accompany this letter represent the work of 3 chandlers, myself, and 2 young monks who are my students. These candles embody the tradition that Brother Cuthbert passed to me, refined through my own 30 years of practice, and further elevated through the advanced teachings that Brother Cuthbert gave to one of my students in his final months. In these candles, Brother Cuthbert's influence lives on. They will burn in the cathedral or in the great church or in the abbot's study. They will provide light for prayer, for study, for simple comfort in the darkness. And in providing that light, they will continue the work that Brother Cuthbert devoted his life to, the transformation of matter into light, the creation of tools that serve the sacred work of the church. I write to you as one approaching the end of his life, knowing that my time in the chandlery is limited. But I write with profound peace, knowing that the work continues, that younger hands are learning what older hands have known, that the tradition will persist and grow long after I have departed this life. May God bless you, and may the light that Brother Cuthbert created continue to illuminate your community for generations to come. In Christ and in craft, Brother Edmund. The autumn light slanted through the high windows of the chandlery, casting long shadows across the work tables where Brothers Thomas and Oswin moved through their familiar rhythms. Edmund sat on a wooden bench near the hearth, watching the flames dance, watching his students work, watching the transformation of beeswax into light that had been his life's devotion. The letter had been sent to Yorkshire, carried by a traveling merchant along with the memorial candles to Brother Cuthbert. The work continued, the steady, patient creation of light for the monastery's needs, the training of younger monks who showed aptitude and calling, the slow accumulation of excellence across generations. Edmund felt at peace in a way that transcended words. His hands, weathered and marked by decades of work, rested gently in his lap. His eyes, though dimmed somewhat by age, could still appreciate the quality of the work being done before him. His heart, which had devoted itself to this craft with unwavering constancy, felt complete. Brother Thomas set down a finished candle on the cooling shelf and glanced over at Edmund with a smile of acknowledgement. A moment of connection between master and student, between past and future, between the work that had been and the work that would continue. Outside, the monastery bells began to ring for vespers, calling the community to evening prayer. Edmund rose slowly, feeling the weight of his 73 years, but also feeling something lighter. The lightness of a burden gracefully set down, of a work well done, of knowledge faithfully passed forward. As he made his way toward the great church, Edmund carried with him the knowledge that the light would continue. It would burn in this candy long after he had gone. It would burn in Yorkshire, where Brother Thomas had trained. It would burn in distant cathedrals and monasteries throughout the lands. It would illuminate prayer and study, and the simple comfort of those afraid of darkness. The candles he had made, thousands upon thousands of them across the decades, would have burned themselves away long before his own light grew dim. But in creating them, he had participated in something eternal, something that transcended the individual life and became part of the great continuity of human effort and excellence, of craft and prayer, of the ancient work of transforming the world into something more beautiful, more luminous, more true. In the church, Edmund took his place with the other monks and raised his voice in the ancient chant of Vespers. The beeswax candles burned steadily around him, their light reflecting off stone and illuminating the faces of his brothers in community. Each flame was an act of love, an offering, a small prayer made visible and tangible. And Edmund, in the midst of that gentle light, felt the profound peace that comes from a life devoted to purpose, from work done with care and intention, from the knowledge that one's hands have created light that will continue to shine long after those hands have returned to dust. The work was complete. The light would continue. And in that continuity, Edmund found everything he had ever needed to know about meaning, about purpose, about the sacred nature of simple, faithful work done in service to something larger than oneself. The bells continued their gentle ringing, calling the faithful to prayer. The candles continued their quiet burning, providing their steady illumination. And in the chandlery, now silent and waiting for the morning's work, the molds rested on their shelves, ready once more for the ancient transformation to begin again.